All right, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and bring the meeting to order. And those that want to, if you could have a seat, please join me in a moment of silence for those that have passed since our last meeting. Thank you. Okay, thank you. We'll go ahead and get the meeting started. So we don't quite have a quorum yet. We have some people that are on their way, so we'll go ahead and just get started. And Steve, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Go ahead and run the meeting until we need to vote.
The first item on the agenda then will be the annual update from the Department of Retirement Systems. And we have the director of the Department of Retirement Systems, Tracy Guerin, here today. As you can imagine, we work closely with DRS through the year on so many issues of shared importance, and they've been great to work with. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Chair, members of the board for having me here today. Always a pleasure to be with you. So just to start, as a reminder, there's some statistics up there about the different employers and plan members and so forth, but I think some of the important pieces are that we serve about 194,000 annuitants. We partner with state and higher education, counties, most cities, and local districts. And just as a reminder, for the next 40 years, about 75% of every beneficiary's pension dollar will come from our investment earnings from the State Investment Board. And so always important to remember that bringing that money in from the employers is how we are able to get those investment returns. Also, we have benefits paid by county here. These are just the LEF annuitants. About 88% of $4.5 billion in benefit payments are paid to in-state recipients, contributing to the state's economy. And for LEF 2, we have about $300 million in benefits that go out to distributed to 6,636 LEF annuitants. That was last fiscal year's data. And I know that you get our CEM information every year about how we're doing in terms of low cost and high service, and we remain there at about $60 per member. DRS continues to be the lower cost with higher service scores as compared to our peers, even though we are one of the most complex. We're the fifth most complex pension in North America. And we do that with some responsive service. I could go through a lot of different data, but again, most importantly, we retired about 13,000 people in fiscal year 18 with just 250 team members. So that's, including answering all the phone calls, having all the walk-ins, doing the web email responses, and so forth. So we do quite a bit of work. We have participation in DCP. We have about 36,000 state members, 18,000 local. January 2017, we went to auto-enroll. We maintain about 92%, 93% people stay in once they've auto-enrolled, as compared to about 5% that we had people contributing to DCP. So we think auto-enroll was a really smart thing to do, and we're excited that people are staying in. We have the opportunity for local governments to join into DCP as well. About 868 out of the 13, about 1,200 local employers do offer DCP, the state's DCP. And we have three local employers that are offering the auto-enroll. They can offer it, all 868 can, but only 3 have opted in so far. So one of the important things I find is that we have so much data, right? And we need to make sure that we're protecting that data. We have everybody's social security number, their addresses, dates of birth, all kinds of information. And one of the things we hadn't done was hired a full-time chief information security officer. And if you look around the states, most everyone has one. So we actually received money in last year's budget in order to hire one. We have one on full-time. While we did a good job with security, I felt like it was something we needed to have a laser focus on, and with a full-time staff person, we are doing that now. So we'll also be asking for some additional funds this year to enhance some of the work that we're doing around security. And we currently do phishing tests. We do a lot of work with multi-factor authentication. You all should have gotten a postcard in the mail saying that we're adding that to our security. We rolled that out last night, so pretty excited about that. Much like other financial institutions, you'll have a second piece of data to put in before you can actually go into your account. In terms of supporting our team members, I think we've spent the last 3 years really focusing on coming into the 21st century. We're trying to modernize a lot of things at DRS. One of them I want to talk about is the physical plant. If you've been out to our building in the last couple of months, you'll notice it's kind of crazy. We're moving people around to different floors as we're modernizing and actually bringing in new furniture. We're doing some work on the physical plant in terms of lighting and all the things that you can imagine that you'd want if you're an employee. We've been in the same building for 20 years, and it wasn't well suited. We're going to be able to fit more people in the building, and we've actually improved the space in terms of lunchrooms and workspaces and collaborative spaces. So pretty excited about that. Assume that will be done October next year. So you'll have to come out and see it after we're all finished with it. We've also went to flex time and compressed work week. I talked a little bit about this last year. We have more than 75% of the team members participating in either a compressed work week or a flexible work schedule. That's allowed us to bring in some new talent as well. We didn't get as high of a interest in working at DRS because we had 8 to 5 schedules, and now that we've went to a compressed work week, we're getting much more interest in working at the department. We also began a telework pilot, so we have about 25 people working from remote locations, mostly from their homes. So we're looking at potentially rolling that out further next year. And then finally, we're looking at policy updates to make our work-life balance better. And we just rolled out infants in the workplace. We don't have a new infant yet, but we're hoping to get one soon so that we can practice that as well. Implementing legislation, you know all the things that we got done last year, pretty excited about it. Now it's all about rolling it out. And so we're busy working on that. Happy to answer questions if you have any on those particular. In terms of the future, I think many of you know that we're doing a record keeper transition. So we're looking at that to happen also about September, October next year. We're working on modernizing our systems. Our systems have been around about 30 years, and it's time to upgrade. We started with looking at our employer reporting applications, and that will finish rolling out the end of this year. And then we're working on modernizing our platform. So the first thing is to get off the legacy system that we're on and going into the cloud. So that's the second piece that we're working on, and we'll be asking for some funds for the mainframe rehosting as well. As far as the future for policy initiatives, we're really interested in protecting member and retiree medical information, so all health records. So we're looking at a bill. We're talking to the governor's office about that right now to make sure that we don't have to give out any health information. We're also looking at reviewing the interest rate paid on inactive accounts. Right now we pay 5.5% to non-vested inactive accounts, that money that's sitting in there. You can't get 5.5% anywhere else. So we're talking to interested parties about lowering that. And then finally, we have a large number of non-vested inactive accounts, and we really want to be able to pay those out instead of maintaining them in administrative fashion. So we can save a little bit of money on that, but also get them out when we can still find the people. Because if we wait till they're 70 and a half and they left their account with us when they were 20, the odds of finding them are not very high. And then one thing I did want to talk about that wasn't in the deck before I answer any questions is that we recently received a request for a public disclosure request for all information on active public employees. So that's all of our public employees. And it's a pretty extensive request. It's first name, full middle name, last name, full date of birth, because the Supreme Court recently ruled on that. Employer, region, work email address. I think there's 11 different items that are being asked for. So we're working out what we can and cannot release. As you know, law enforcement, we cannot release date of birth on that. So we're trying to cull through everything that we can or cannot release, what we can actually pull out of our systems. And we'll be contacting associations, unions, and so forth, so that, and working with our employers to notify employees of the request. But did want to make you aware since I was here today in front of you. So with that, that was pretty quick. But do you have any questions?
Any questions, Tracy? Mark?
Yeah, could you tell us the group that's making that request?
The Evergreen Freedom Foundation.
Any other questions for Tracy? All right, thank you, Tracy, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, since we have a quorum, I'm going to go ahead and jump back to our agenda item number 1, and that is the approval of our September and October minutes. So is there a motion on the table for approval of the September, October minutes? Okay. Who was the motion? Okay, very good. All right. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Okay, motion passes. All right. On to our agenda number 3. And go ahead, Steve.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, when the board was created, there was a requirement in the initiative that the board undergo an annual financial audit. For many years, that annual audit was done by the firm of the Davis Accounting, Steve Davis. Last year, the State Auditor's Office took over that role, and this year, in continuation, the State Auditor's Office will also be presenting the results of this year's annual financial audit. And with that, I will turn it over to the gentleman from the Auditor's Office. Thank you.
Good morning, members of the board. My name is Jim Brunell. I'm an audit manager with SAO. So joining me today are 2 members of my team. On my right, Michael Hutchinson. He was the audit supervisor. And to my left is Justin Brackett, who was the auditor in charge for this engagement. So a little bit about our office there. Just introduced ourselves. We're supported by our executive team, Sadie Armijo, our director, and Troy Niemeyer, our assistant director. So the scope of the audit was the scheduled expenditures for state fiscal year 2019. And we're happy to report that for the audit, we issued a clean or unmodified opinion, which means the financial statements were presented fairly in all material respects. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin and Mike to talk about some highlights and some required communications we have for you today.
Hello, good morning. My name is Justin Brackett. As Jim said, I was the lead on the engagement, and I'm here to talk about what we did and some highlights about the audit. The first thing I have to say is that we had a good statement to audit, and we had great staff to work with. Board staff were very responsive to our requests and provided us what we needed in a timely manner. There were no uncorrected misstatements in the schedule of expenditures at the end of the audit, and there were no material misstatements in the audit, or the schedule that needed to be corrected by management. So we had a good, clean report. So during the financial statement audit, we evaluate internal controls. Oh, you got that, Jim? Okay. We evaluate internal controls over key financial systems and processes. And we evaluate whether or not there are adequate internal controls over the financial statement preparation process itself. We then test transactions or expenditures, and then we examine the note disclosures to ensure that they were fairly and clearly presented. The particular areas of focus of your audit were on salaries and wages and board expenses for other purchased services. We evaluated salaries and wages to determine whether or not those expenditures were reported completely, meaning whether or not we reported everything that we should have. There were no exceptions in that area. We evaluated the board expenses for other purchased services to determine whether or not those were classified correctly. And once again, our audit revealed that they were. There were no exceptions in that area. So we'll turn it over to Mike, and he'll talk a little bit about presentations and disclosures.
After we review the expenditure line items, we take a look at the presentation and disclosure of the financial statement. We perform a testing to determine whether the financial statement was clearly and appropriately presented. It was, and were not disclosure complete and accurate, and they were. And if there were any significant financial event occurred and properly disclosed in the note to the financial statement, and there was no significant financial event occurred during the audit period. And we made no recommendation to the management. Everything looks good. Well, we shared the draft report, audit report with the management, and based on our plan, our final audit report will be issued sometime next week. Okay. The actual cost of audit was $4,400, and should the board choose to contract with our officer again, we estimated the cost will be the same as this year's. And always pleasure with working with the board members and the staff, so we really appreciate the opportunity. Any questions related to our audit?
Are there any questions? I want to express my appreciation. You guys did a great job working with staff and making sure the disruption to the regular workflow was minimal. So I wanted to share my appreciation here publicly as well. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is a comprehensive presentation of the tribal participation in LEFT study that was required by the legislature. There's no board action expected on this today. It'll be before you for a final presentation next month. With that, I'll turn it over to Jacob.
Here we go. Good morning, board members. For the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. The board received an initial presentation in July on this subject. Since then, board staff has completed a survey of the tribes, the tribal police departments. We also have received finalized legal advice from our outside tax counsel, Ice Miller, and then we've gathered additional information regarding some of the questions that were raised during the, we had a handful of tribal police officers and other representatives testify at our last meeting, and so did some research based on some of the issues they raised and questions they asked, and then also some of the questions that were asked by the board members. So as Steve said, the legislature tasked the Left 2 board with studying the tax, legal, fiscal, policy, and administrative issues related to allowing tribal law enforcement officers to become Left 2 members. The report is due to the legislature by January 1st, 2020. And this was in a budget proviso from last year's budget, so it also included funding for the board to conduct this research and work with our outside tax counsel. So quick overview, the Federal Pension Protection Act of 2006 changed the definition of governmental plans to include Indian tribal plans covering workers doing governmental work. This allowed for tribes to join public pension plans or to create their own public pension plan. However, there are federal restrictions and state laws to prevent some tribal employees from joining state governmental plans, including Left 2, and that's what we're going to address a lot of those issues here today, or discuss those. So we discussed some of them in the last report, but we're going to expand. I'm going to expand on those in this presentation. The last report was very broad. We had a lot of background information around tribal police and kind of jurisdictional information. And in this presentation, I'm trying to narrow down on some of the specific pension issues. Those issues include non-governmental employee risk, general authority versus limited authority tribal police officers, tribal police survey results, the retiree return to work impacts, withdrawal liability, and Bockenhouse concerns. So the non-governmental employee risk, this is a federal law issue. Employees engaged in commercial activities are barred from joining governmental plans. If a governmental plan covers even one commercial employee, the plan risks losing its governmental plan status. I should say I didn't find an example of that occurring, but the IRS is very clear that that is a risk. And then law enforcement is identified by the IRS as a governmental activity. So that was nice to see that it was one activity that was called out specifically as being governmental activity. So it might not be necessary for me to walk through the whole test, but I'm still going to walk through some parts of kind of high level of the test the IRS uses. And I should add that this issue was raised in some of the testimony after the last presentation, that as far as the IRS only applies this to tribes, that there are examples of state employees. The biggest example that no longer is true, but was for a long time, state-run liquor stores, clearly a commercial activity, but those employees were covered by governmental plans. So the IRS is, at least in this instance, only concerned with the commercial activities in regards to tribal members or tribal employees being covered by a governmental plan. In my research, I was trying to find examples of commercial activities. I don't know if everyone's heard of this one, but I thought it was kind of interesting, is that there is a small city, Bonneville, that has a city-owned and operated marijuana retail store, and those employees are covered under PERS. So that's kind of a good example of that. So the IRS test, the IRS has a two-part test to determine if an employee is eligible or not. Part one of that test is whether the activities are commercial or governmental. And then, of course, it's the IRS, so they have a test within a test. So the facts and circumstance test is for part one. And what they look at there is it an activity that's operated to earn a profit? Is it typically performed by private businesses? And is it for customers who are substantially from outside of the Indian tribal community, including whether the activity is located or conducted outside of Indian tribal land? And then part two of that test is whether an employee's duties are substantially in the performance of a governmental activity or a commercial activity. The second part of this is one I'll focus on, the source of the employee's payroll. It's an issue that we discussed during the last presentation on this subject. So it was brought up in the last presentation in regards to gambling revenue and other commercial activity revenue, and whether there was any issues with the police department receiving funding from that, even though it wasn't going directly from the commercial activity to the police department. Did the IRS have any concerns with that money going to the tribal government and then being allocated to the different departments, including the police department? And so we reached out to ICE Miller for advice on that, and they got back and said there were no issues with that, that the IRS does not require that the funds from governmental activities remain completely separate. So on to state law issues. Left to eligibility is another area that would need to be addressed. For tribal law enforcement officers to be eligible for Left 2, both the officers and the employers need to meet the eligibility requirements for Left 2. And so one of the first of those eligibility requirements is the employer. So the definition of employer would need to be amended. In Left 2, who is a Left 2 employer is identified pretty clearly, and tribes are not included in that. So it would need to be amended to include them. And then there's a more complex issue regarding opt-in versus mandated. So currently, if an employer falls within the definition of a Left Plan 2 employer, they are mandated in. And that's not true for all the systems. For example, PERS, there are some employers. Now, a lot of employers in all the systems are mandated in, but there are some employers in PERS who opt in. But when they do choose to opt in, it is, you can't get out of it. Once you opt in, you're in. And so this would create, and that's been the Left Plan 2 policy, is that you're mandated in, and this would create an issue for tribes. We discussed this at the last presentation, but tribal sovereignty is a major issue. With tribes being part of this, they would have to do a limited waiver of sovereign immunity for purposes of enforcing the pension laws and administrative requirements. And so you couldn't mandate a tribe in and then have them follow those laws. They would have to opt in, and there would be work on that limited waiver of sovereign immunity. And this would be a change in policy for Left Plan 2 to allow an employer the option to be a Left 2 employer. And I should add, there currently is a process for tribal compact schools to opt in. So we talked about that last presentation too, that tribal compact schools have recently been let into TERS and SERS. And they are the only employer in TERS and SERS that's not mandated into membership. And so the legislature has created a similar process that I was discussing that allows those tribes to opt in. And then we have member eligibility. So for member eligibility, a law enforcement officer is eligible for Left 2 if they are first employed by Left 2 employer, commissioned, full-time, and fully compensated. And so full-time, fully compensated is pretty straightforward. Commissioned is an area that becomes more complex, especially for tribal law enforcement. And we got into some of this at the last presentation, but based off some of the testimony that the tribes provided, kind of gave me some guidance to go back and get some more detail. So DRS defines commissioned as an employee is employed as an officer of a general authority Washington law enforcement agency and is empowered by that employer to enforce the criminal laws of the state of Washington. And then the definition of general authority is there in front of you. I won't read you that one too. So what is general authority? So general authority officers may enforce criminal or traffic laws of the state throughout the territorial boundaries in certain circumstances, a major one being with the support and approval of an interlocal agreement. Allows them to cross boundaries and still enforce laws. Meanwhile, a limited authority officer is any full-time, fully compensated officer of a limited authority Washington law enforcement agency, empowered by that agency to detect or apprehend violators of the laws in some or all of the limited subject areas for which that agency is responsible. So some common examples that you're probably familiar with are Liquor and Cannabis Board enforcement officers, Gambling Commission special agents, and Department of Natural Resources police officers. Would all be examples of limited authority officers. So there are general and limited authority tribal police officers. General authority is a fairly recent development. In 2008, tribal police officers gained the ability to act as general authority officers if the tribal government meets specific requirements regarding certification, insurance liability, and administration. And so they go through a certification requirement at the CJTC, but on top of that, they have to do these other requirements regarding insurance liability, administration, some other issues, and they do that through Department of Enterprise Systems. And so some tribes receive training and certification from the CJTC, but they do not meet the other requirements for general authority certification, and that was an issue that I got a little wrong in my last presentation. So thank you for the tribes for providing some clarification on that during the last meeting. So how many tribes have this certification? Worked with DES and CJTC to get some data on this, and there are 11 tribes that have general authority certification, while 23 have CJTC certification. And so under current law, only the general authority would be eligible. If the legislature wants limited authority tribal police officers to be eligible for a state pension plan, they would either need to change the underlying policy of Left Plan 2 to expand to include these limited authority officers, or they may want to consider allowing them to be eligible for PSERS, which is where some of the officers, limited authority officers I listed before, where the pension system they're covered under. But those tribes would obviously have the option to gain general authority certification if they wanted to be members of Left 2. So the survey I mentioned beginning, so we did a brief survey to all the tribal police chiefs in Washington. 12 tribes responded. 9 tribes expressed interest in joining Left 2. I kept the questions pretty high level, didn't want to bury them with a super long survey, was more interested in hearing back from as many tribes as possible. The questions asked in the survey were regarding their interest and concerns in joining Left 2, and then as well as details related to each tribe's full-time officers. I consulted with OSA prior to sending out the survey to make sure I was asking some questions that would allow them to give us some pricing guidance on what the impact of tribal police officers joining the system would be. There was a mix. I think most of them were general, but there was, I know for sure one was limited authority. And there is I didn't cram it on a slide, but in the materials there is a couple tables that break down which tribes have which certifications. So regarding the interest, this is what we heard at the last board meeting when there was testimony. The main interest is recruitment and retention of high-quality police officers. The tribes viewed being part of Left 2 as being a great recruitment and retention tool. Concerns raised were how retired Left 2 members would be affected. Many of the tribes recruit retired Left 2 members, and then they were aware that this would impact that in some way and had questions about exactly how that would be impacted. They were, of course, wanted to know what the costs and benefits of the system were, whether all officers in the participating tribe would be required to join. And my take on this those questions were really regarding the first bullet point of could they avoid it impacting retirees, and then whether every tribe would need to be part of the system, which we discussed already, and how tribal sovereignty would be impacted. And so many of these discussions I've already discussed or discussed in a previous presentation or will discuss later in this one. So we hope to thoroughly answer all these questions in our final report that goes to the legislature. So is one of those tables I tried to cram onto a slide. This was the tribes we heard back from in the survey. Some of the tribes did get back to us that did not have an interest in joining, but here's the list of number of full-time officers, average salaries. Now, the average salary, I did not complicate it by explaining what salary is included and what salary is not, so that does impact kind of the accuracy of this, of whether, for example, the tribes included overtime or not. I know that there was a mix of that, and some demographic data regarding the average age and the average years of service. As I mentioned, this data was gathered in part to assist OSA with their fiscal analysis, and that will be completed before our December meeting and included in the final report. And then also, I couldn't fit it on this slide, but did also ask the tribes about what they currently offer their employees as far as retirement plans. And 9 tribes that responded currently offer a 401k retirement plan. There's one tribe that also offers their officers a profit-sharing plan and a tax-exempt retirement savings plan in addition to a 401k plan. Most of these 401k plans required a matching contribution from members before the employer put any money into it. And then I should add also the maximum percentage of employer contribution rate for these 401ks were all less than the current Left Plan 2 employer contribution rate, which is 8.59. So that would be something for the tribes to consider with joining, that they would be paying more than most of them currently are for their 401k plans. And also their members would be paying, their employees would be paying more as well. So retiree return to work impacts. Currently, tribal police departments are not DRS covered employers. Therefore, they're not subject to retiree return to work laws. If the tribes become Left 2 employers, then Left 2 retirees who work for tribes, for tribal police tribes as police officers, I should add, would no longer be able to work for them without rejoining Left 2 membership and stopping their Left 2 retirement benefit. another area that's more complex, and there's not a definitive answer on how this would be impacted. I've been talking to DRS, and there's a case ongoing right now that would impact this. But there are, for the other systems not left to, there's the 2008 early retirement factor restrictions for non-left to members working for the tribal police departments and potentially the tribe. And so those are called the 2008 IRFs is what they're referred to as. And it allows PERS, SIRS, and TERS members with 30 years of service credit to retire at age 62 without taking a reduction in their benefit, or earlier than that with a smaller reduction than they would normally take. But it has a strict impact on their ability to return to work in any capacity, much broader than the other return to work restrictions for the other pension systems. And so you can't return as a contractor. Pretty much in any way you cannot return to work for a public DRS covered employer. And if they do, their benefit stops for each month that they work. They do not receive a check for that month until they stop employment. Before the age of 65. Once they're 65, then they're good. Okay.
Did that answer your question? Okay.
So the question is, would this, if tribes became left to employers, would the 2008 early retirement factors apply to their employees? And I believe it would likely apply to the tribal police department, but it may apply to all positions within the tribal government. And so there's a case ongoing right now out of the city of Spokane, Romero versus DRS. And it's, like I said, it's an ongoing case, but it may, the department held that so City of Spokane is a first-class employer, so the only reason they are a DRS-covered employer is because they have firefighter and police officers, so they're a left-to employer. And DRS, their initial administrative decision was that they were impacted by the 2008 early retirement factors applied to all of the City of Spokane employees. And so that's currently being challenged. So another issue is withdrawing from left to. So as I mentioned before, joining a Washington state pension system is a permanent decision. There is no option for an employer to withdraw. However, you may be aware of employers who have dissolved. So if the employer no longer exists, then they are not. Then they're not members. There are some other states that allow withdrawal, but most do not. And when employers do dissolve, the plan currently subsidizes any potential liability of those employers. So this is an issue that came up with tribal compact schools, and tribal compact schools are currently being treated similar to charter schools. So charter schools, there's been at least a couple I'm aware of, charter schools that have, so they're mandated into membership, charter schools. And if they dissolve, they then no longer have any liability. And so tribal compact schools are unique in that they only exist for the lifetime of the compact that the tribe signs with OSPI, with the state. And those compacts are typically 2 or 3 years long. And so if they don't re-up that compact, then they are no longer a tribal compact school. They revert to a tribal school and no longer receive funding from the state. And at that point, they dissolve as a TERS and SIRS employer. Let's see. But there was some concern about that and how the IRS may look at that. So the law that allowed tribal compact schools to join TERS and SIRS addresses that potential risk. It has language in there regarding that the compact is clear about expectations and duties if the compact does terminate, that it addresses that, how that's going to work. And the compact is also required to acknowledge that there may be federal tax implications of withdrawing that the state has no control over. So that would be something to consider if there was going to be a way for a change in policy that allowed a tribal police department to withdraw. And so I did want to touch a bit on that too, that some states do allow employers to withdraw. I mentioned that. These plans typically follow procedures similar to those required of private ERISA-covered multi-employer plans. Under ERISA, employers are required to pay what's called withdrawal liability to leave the plan. And under ERISA, withdrawal liability is the amount of the unfunded vested benefit. So this would be a decision for policymakers if the law should specify whether the decision for tribal police departments to join Left 2 is irrevocable, or whether there will be some option to withdraw. If withdrawal is an option, the law should specify the withdrawal process and potentially any withdrawal liability. If the law does not specify this, then Left 2 plan could end up subsidizing any withdrawal without clear intent that that's what the goal of the legislature is. And then the issue of Bockenhouse was raised by a board member during my last presentation. And I was going to give Senator Holy a bad time about being a pension nerd by calling it by knowing it's a Bockenhouse concern. Bockenhouse is just a shorthand for case law that held that pension plan members have contractual rights to their benefits, and there are strict limitations on how those benefits can be altered. In the tribal compact school legislation, the legislature addressed potential Bockenhouse concerns. There was concerns that the tribal compact schools could claim that they had a Bockenhouse right to remain in the pension plan, even if their employer withdrew from membership. And so the law clearly stated that those employees do not have those Bockenhouse rights. So the legislature may want to include something similar if they were going to allow tribal police departments to join Left 2. So just put together here a kind of the issues we've discussed in the two presentations that policymakers should address in any legislation that would allow tribal police officers to be eligible for Left 2. Kind of just touched on most of these, and then a couple that were in the previous presentation, including should tribal police officers be able to purchase retroactive service credit. That seems to be, doesn't necessarily need to be in the law, but may want to be something they consider as it seems to come up. It was just at the select committee yesterday, and it was an issue coming up with PSERS members. So whenever new members are allowed in a pension system, it seems that issue seems to be raised of whether there should be an option for them to go back and purchase service credit for previous work experience. And if they are allowed to do that, then do they pay the full actuarial value of that? Is it split with the employer? Is any of it subsidized by the plan? So the next steps for the board, no action is required by the board. At the December board meeting, I'll be providing a final presentation, including having a draft report to the legislature. And as I mentioned, it will include information from OSA regarding the fiscal impacts. And so if there's any issues, questions the board would like to see addressed or expanded on in the final report, I'd be happy to hear those. And
I have a few questions
yeah.
for you, Jacob. Thank you for that. This is a great comprehensive presentation. I appreciate it. In the surveys, we mentioned the tribes. Are we hearing back from the police agencies of the tribes, or are we hearing back from the tribe as an employer? Are we hearing from employers?
I sent it to the tribal police department, to the chiefs of the tribal police departments, and so that's who I believe they've had the nature of the questions as far as getting data about the employees. I believe most of them have been working with the employer, or at least the HR department, but I don't know for certain whether they've been, whether they're in agreement with with the tribe that they want to join.
Obviously, because there's the component where the employer obviously owns a fair stake in this process, and I just was curious if we're hearing from any of them directly, or have you heard from an employer that has
I think
a support or concern?
The main employer I've heard from is the Puyallup tribe. That they've been in communication with me, and CCing the tribal police, some representatives from the employer. And then I have also got calls from tribal police officers wondering if their employer has, contacted me wanting to join, and so there's some interest by the police officers, but not interest from the employer.
Gotcha. And then this may fall into your presentation next year, but there's obviously a large federal component to this as well. Is that something that you're going to key in on next presentation?
I could provide more detail on that. I mean, that was the beginning of the presentation, trying to address the main issue that the feds seem concerned about, is making sure that there is no commercial employees in it, that's the greatest risk. And I know when tribal compact schools were added to the system, that was the main concern from policymakers, is that it could potentially have this huge impact on the whole plan and system if one mistake is made.
Right. Okay, my last question is on the actuarial buyback. So it kind of clicked I guess I don't know if past practice is the best way to say it, but our current policy is for a member who wants to buy a year, it is currently the actuarial value. Is that correct? So the best example that comes to my mind would be, if somebody some type of military duty that is not covered by the current Left 2 plan, and they want to purchase that year, it's the complete actuarial value. Is that correct?
There's a few different ways. I'm
Okay.
looking to Steve for help here, but typically, like in that situation, it's not quite the full actuarial value. It's close. It's they would pay the member and employer, but not the interest. And then there's been it seems like every time there's another bill that allows people to purchase service credit, it's slightly different than the previous one as far as whether any of it's subsidized or none of it's subsidized.
The past practice has been all over the board in terms of these types of bills. And so, going all the way from the plan subsidizing some to the plan subsidizing none, employer contributions, yes or no, interest, yes or no. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think in the last 7 or 8 bills, they've probably done it 5 different ways.
Okay.
I think often it comes down to whether the employer is if they're willing to pay any of it.
Okay. Any other questions for Jake? Representative Berquist?
Hey, thank you. Couple questions. It looks like, give or take, there might be about 100 tribal officers or currently that might become eligible that are general authority. I was wondering if that's give or take about right. And then how many of those potential are potentially left retirees? I was kind of curious if we have any idea.
Yeah, I do not have that information, so I could go back and contact. I could talk to OSA about that too, since they're working on pricing this. Kind of if they use some assumptions about that, and I'd have to go back and get the number on the total number that are potentially that the employer is interested in joining and that are general authority. I just don't have the math right in front of me, but I could do that.
Then one other question. The other 23 tribes, how easy is it if they wanted to join? Is it possible to become general authority? What is that transition, or how does that work?
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear from the tribes, and then I could talk to them about why they haven't done that. I think that they're, in part, might be because of the interlocal agreements they have to sign. That might be a holdup for it, because, like I said, most of them are paying for and going through the CJTC training. So I can reach out to the tribes to get information about if there's anything specific holding them back from becoming general authority.
That just prompted another question, and I'm drawing on the experience from my county with the Cowlitz tribe. My understanding is that the sheriff of the county that the tribe is in, when it comes to non-general authority versus CJTC, is that the sheriff has to sign off on that authority. And it's a nebulous process for me. And as a first-line supervisor dealing with the Cowlitz tribe and how that works, there's a lot of moving parts to it. But I do know that my sheriff does have to sign off on the CJTC component of it to authorize that general authority for that tribe to operate in that county.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's something that's come up with you or not yet, but it comes down to the CJTC versus general authority component.
Yeah. I will definitely reach out to the Puyallup tribe because I believe from the data I got that they are, I know they're interested in joining and they are not general authority, so I can at least reach out to them and find out what their concerns are.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for Jacob? Yeah. Mark Johnson?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if most tribal police officers are organized or not, or do they have employee groups that represent the employees separate from the employer as a police department or as a tribe as the employer?
I have not asked that question, so we can.
So I'm just interested in, I mean, you can get information about whether the employer is interested, but I would just, if there's a way to gauge whether the employees, you know, of their own volition are interested or not, I would be interested in that.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jacob? AJ, did you have a question? Okay. Yeah.
So there? I don't think there's any tribal fire departments, but it's certainly a possibility in the future. So, if we allowed the tribes to opt into this, would that include firefighters too if they had a fire department?
Look to see if I believe the law would need to be amended specifically to include them, and then definitely a compact would need to be signed allowing for that. And I do know that Arizona actually does have a tribal police and fire in their pension system, so there's a precedent for it in another state.
And Jacob, remind me, we did try to find out if there were any tribal fire departments, and we didn't find any
Could not
either,
find
right?
any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jacob.
My understanding was that there was nobody signed up for public testimony on this issue. Is that correct, or is there anybody who would like to testify? Okay, and then this will be back again in December for a final presentation, and there'll be an opportunity to testify at that time as well. Thank you, Jacob. Next up on the agenda is the annual actuarial valuation that is conducted by the Office of the State Actuary. You've got Mitch DeCamp and Frank Serra presenting the LEF AVR this year. This report is not used for rate setting, so there's no action required by the board, but it's the annual check-in about the actuarial status of the plan. With that, I will turn it over to the gentleman from OSA.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, Mitch DeCamp, Office of the State Actuary. I am joined today by Frank Serra, also from the Office of the State Actuary, and today we'll be presenting to you on the 2018 LEF2 actuarial valuation results. So for today's presentation, we're going to break this thing into three parts. We're going to start out with a little bit of general background on actuarial valuations. Then we're going to take a look at the 2018 valuation results, and then we're going to finish up with a look ahead to next year's valuation. Because there's a lot going into next year's valuation, and so we want to give you a preview of what's going to be included in there. And then as a reminder, Steve said it off the top, there is no board action needed today. So Frank and I are going to split this. I am going to start out with the background and then part of the valuation results. Frank is going to finish up with the valuation results and then cover the look ahead to next year. The first thing I wanted to take a look at today was an overview of the actuarial valuation process. How do we get from participant data all the way to contribution rates? So this flow chart captures all of that, and I think I've presented this before, but I think it's a good reminder of all the steps that we take to get there. So starting on the left side of this flow chart, the two gray circles are our inputs. The top one is DRS census data, and what that is a data file we receive from DRS that has a record for every member. It has age, salary, benefit amount if they're retired. It has all the fields we need to value the members. The other input we receive is asset information, and that comes from WSIB and DRS, and that is just the assets as of the valuation date that are available to pay benefits. So we take those two inputs, we combine them in our first dark blue rectangle there, OSA valuation, and that represents our model. And in our model, we have all of our programming of all of the plan provisions, all of our assumptions for the future, and then our model also uses the methods to project those assumptions into the future. Now, the output of that model is the valuation assets and liabilities. Assets are just the amount of assets available to pay benefits, and then liabilities are our estimate of what future benefits are going to be paid from the system. Now, during a rate setting valuation, this then goes to an actuarial audit. The output of that is then contribution rates, which are set based off of the funding policy either set by the legislature for the rest of the plans or the LEF 2 board for LEF 2. And then during a rate setting valuation only, we would present the contribution rates to potentially be adopted by either the Pension Funding Council for all the other plans or this board for LEF 2. So what we're going to do today is, this is kind of our roadmap. We're going to look at each of these pieces in a little bit more detail. Before we do that, though, just a couple more notes on the 2018 valuation, the one that we're going to be talking about today. This is considered an off-cycle valuation. And what that means is that under the current contribution rate setting cycle, even-numbered years like 2018 are considered off-cycle or non-rate setting. And that just means it's an information-only update on things like contribution rates, funding progress, and any developments in the plan over the last year. So really similar to rate-setting valuations, we reflect new data, assets, and any legislation, but unlike rate-setting valuations, the contribution rates are not collected. The contribution rates that we calculate are not collected. Really, this just gives us a chance to take another snapshot of the plan and say, how has the plan changed over the last year, and how has our estimate of what the plan is going to look like in the future changed as well? So, what has happened in the plan over the last year? This slide is a highlight of all of the 2018 valuation results we're going to talk about today. We've split this presentation into these highlights are split into 4 sections, so I'm going to go through them quickly, but we are going to touch on all of these in a little bit more detail. So starting with participant data, what we saw in participant data was that annuitant growth outpaced active membership growth. What's that mean? That means annuitant population is growing faster than the active membership. And that's expected. That's expected because LEF 2 is a maturing plan. Matt talked a little bit about that in his July presentation as well. And what we see because of that is that that ratio of actives to annuitants has continued to decline in the short term. Again, that's all expected because it's a maturing plan. Switching over to assets. And so investments returned 9.56%. That is higher than the assumed return of 7.4%. So that's good news. Another solid year of investment returns produced by the WSIB. The other piece of assets is that asset transfer of $300 million to the Benefit Improvement Account, or the BIA. So that happened this year in 2019. What we're talking about is a valuation a year ago in 2018. As actuaries, we are required to include significant events after the valuation date, and a $300 million transfer qualifies as a significant event. So what we did is we took that $300 million in 2019, we determined the value of it in 2018 using our assumed rate of return, and so that came out to be $279 million. So we removed $279 million from the 2018 assets to account for that transfer. The good news is then all of the measures that you're going to see that are going to come out of this valuation are already going to account for that asset transfer. So where we can see that asset transfer is in the last 2 pieces here, funded status and contribution rates. Funded status decreased from 109 to 108%, and that decrease was primarily from that asset transfer. Similar story with contribution rates. Rates increased under the aggregate cost method. That's that underlying cost method for the plan, and for the minimum contribution rate policy compared to the prior valuation. Again, mainly due to that BIA asset transfer. So looking at participant data in a little more detail here, on this slide we have a table with the last 4 years, the last 4 valuations of a summary of participant data for actives and annuitants. And I think in past presentations I have just shown you the current year and the prior year. This time I wanted to go for 4 years to really show you what the historical trends in this have looked like. So starting with actives, for headcounts and average annual salary, we see those increase year over year. That's expected. The two that I want to focus on for actives is that average age and service. We actually see a decrease in the average age and service as we move from 2015 through to 2018. Now, that's because older members in the plan are retiring, they're being replaced with younger members, and those younger members are also coming in with no service, which is decreasing that average age and service. And this is expected as the plan is continuing to mature. We're seeing this exact same thing happen in all the other open plans like PERS 2.3 and TERS 2.3. For annuitants, headcounts have seen sizable increases over the last 4 years. Again, that's exactly what we expect to see as the plan continues to mature. Average annual benefits also increase. Active members are retiring with higher salaries, and current retirees are receiving cost of living adjustments year after year. So that's why we see the average annual benefit increase as well. Final thing I want to point out on this slide is that actives to annuitants ratio down at the bottom, decreasing from 2015 to 2018. Matt talked a lot about this during his July presentation, so I'll just touch on it now. That decrease, again, is because of the plan continuing to mature. That's exactly what we expect to see year over year. I also want to take a quick look at what the demographics we project to look like in the future. So on this slide, we have taken a look at what the projected demographics look like 5, 10, and 15 years out into the future. To do this, we relied on our projection system, the same one that we relied on to show you projected funded status during your off-site meeting. But this time, instead of projecting funded status, we're projecting plan demographics. So we're using assumptions about how many new hires are going to join the system, about the demographics of what those new hires look like, and then coming up with what the total average demographics of the plan could potentially look like in the future.
You probably are using it, but I just want to, do we actually put in mortality rates in this also?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So for the active members, starting with 2018, that's our last known valuation. Headcounts increase as we step out into the future, and then we come back to that average age in service, and we see decreases as we go out 5 years, but then as we get out 10 to 15 years, we see it stabilize around 42 years old and 13 years of service. And this is expected. This is where we get to this point to where the plan has reached this certain threshold where this average age in service is going to stay like that for the rest of our projection period. We see the same thing happen in the other open plans. The left two tends to be a little younger in that average age in service because of the earlier retirement eligibility in left two. For annuitants, we see those annuitant headcounts increase year over year as we would expect. We step out into the future, more and more people become retirement eligible and ultimately retire. And then the final piece, this is the projection of that actives to annuitants ratio, and we see that decrease, but around 10 years, 15 years, we see it start to stabilize around that 1.5 level. And I don't have it on this table, but if we go out 20, 25, 30 years into the future, stays right at about 1.5. So really similar story to that average age in service where these open plans, they tend to stabilize around specific levels in the future. And the levels that we're predicting them to stabilize, that's all based on our assumptions that the future could look very different, but this is just to give you an estimate from where we stand right now of what it could look like. Now, I just do want to point out, similar, Matt said this back in July, but that actives to annuitants ratio, it's decreasing, but from our end, there's really no concern for left two at this time. Really, this actives to annuitants ratio and where it's going can be an issue for closed plans with low levels of funding, just the opposite of LEV 2. LEV 2 is an open plan with solid levels of funding. So from where we stand right now, this decreasing trend is of no concern. And so with that, I am happy to answer any questions on what I've covered. And if not, I will turn it over to Frank, and he will finish up the evaluation results.
Quick question. Okay, on the, just for a point of clarification, on the active denudants, can you explain what that number is? For instance, 1.5, is that one active to 3, just for clarification?
1.5 actives for one annuitant.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to pick it up with assets. And what we're showing here is a summary of a few key asset measures over the past 2 valuation years. And there's 2 items here I'd like to point out in particular. The first one is that bottom row, the investment return on assets. You could see that for 2018, the returns once again were quite strong, coming in at 9.56%, which was above our assumption of 7.4%. And then the second takeaway is that the top row, the market value of assets for 2018, does reflect that BIA transfer that Mitch mentioned earlier on in the presentation. And one of the implications of that BIA transfer was that our contributions less disbursements, that's our cash flow number for 2018, does come out negative. But there's no reason to be alarmed by that because, again, that is attributable to the BIA transfer. In absence of that transfer, the cash flow would have been positive, and it would have been only a slight decline from last year's cash flow of $117 million. So I referenced the market value of assets here, but it's important to remember that that market value can be quite volatile. It fluctuates up and down year to year, depending on fluctuations in the market itself. And so to provide more stability to the assets, we use the actuarial value of assets rather than the market value. And so that actuarial value of assets, or AVA, what is it doing? Well, it's smoothing out the market fluctuations. And what that means is that it's providing less volatility. And that's important because when we go to do things like calculating funded status or the underlying contribution rates for the plan, we're looking for predictability and stability, which is what the AVA, the actuarial value of assets, does a better job of providing. And so with my next visual here, I'm just hoping to sort of walk through that AVA process because what it's accomplishing is deferring a portion of each year's investment gains and losses to later years. So for 2018, for an example, you see that the actual investment returns were about $1.1 billion, that top blue bar. Our expectation was that it would return $870 million. So the actuals outperformed our expectations, and that means that we have a gain, an investment gain to the system to the tune of $254 million.
Yeah. Go ahead, Representative Berquist.
Frank, so curious on the BIA, why wouldn't we smooth that as well? So the smoothing of the BIA, and then we would probably smooth this number over like 5 years because that would have changed the asset return, or the value for 2018 and 2019.
Yeah, that's a good question. It is a sort of a one-time reduction to the plan. It's sort of like a transfer. I guess you could think of it as like a transfer out to the plan, and when that normally occurs, it is recognized all at once. I'm not sure if that's entirely.
But they don't seem to be different in terms of you get a 15% return. That's a one-time return. You have a $300 million outlay. That's a one-time outlay. Why don't they smooth in the same ways?
Yeah. You want to check?
I believe the policy is to smooth investment returns, and that's a transfer handled differently. The policy will be just to smooth investment returns. Functionally, I believe you're correct. They're going to flow through the plan assets, the market value similarly, but the policy is to just smooth investment returns.
Right, could have had impact on how we smooth this return. It probably would have been over 5 years or maybe even 7 had we have changed how we smoothed, if we would have smoothed the BIA.
So and I might get a little bit more technical here, so I'm happy to follow up with you later on. But the amount of time that we smooth those assets over is determined, I'm sorry? Yes, by the percentage. And so when we went about this, we looked at that percentage in lieu of the BIA transfer. So we made sure that that investment return percentage wasn't being impacted by the transfer. I could follow up after the presentation.
Frank, so what I'm hearing you say is the BIA was not smooth because it wasn't an investment gain or loss, and the impact of the BIA did not affect the smoothing of the investment gains from 2018. Is that correct?
You are correct.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm happy to follow up, like I said, with more information later.
I guess I think it did affect how we smoothed, because it would have been let's say a 12% return had we have smoothed the BIA over 2 years, for example. And so that changes the percentage of increase above the 7.4, and that changes how many years you smooth. So I think it does impact it, but maybe I'm missing it.
Yeah.
I think the amount that would have been smoothed, but not the period. So there's less money now available to be smoothed, but the percentage gain and loss wasn't affected. The investment gain wasn't affected by the transfer. We'll get that clarified for you then.
Yeah. Okay, so on that $254 million gain, again, we're going to smooth that out over a period of time. And we touched upon it a little bit already, but that period of time that it gets smoothed out over is determined by the investment return percentage. So in this case, we're going to smooth that out over 3 years. So we decompose that $254 million into 3 chunks, I guess you can think of, roughly $85 million each. The first piece, that gray box off to the left, is recognized immediately. And then the remaining 2 pieces, which total to about $170 million, those are going to be recognized down the road in later years. Those are the assets that we're deferring. So we're going to take these same boxes in just a slightly different background here. On the left-hand side, you still have that 1 year that has been recognized already, the gray box. And then the remaining 2 years that will be recognized in the future, that $170 million. Now, the actuarial value of assets isn't just looking at this 1 year, it's going to also look back at the past few years as well. So for 2017, for example, 2017 was another strong investment return year. We've recognized 2 years worth of that return, the gray boxes on the left-hand side in that 2017 row. And then we still have $484 million of assets to be recognized in the future. Likewise, for 2016, it was a negative return. It was a loss. We have $249 million left to recognize in the future. 2015 is fully recognized by this point. And 2014 has a $329 million gain left to realize. 2014, it was a very strong investment return year. And it actually, we deferred that amount over 8 years, which is the maximum that's allowed under this method. So when you add up all of those green and red 'tis the season boxes on the right-hand side of the chart, you get $734 million, which is the total amount of gains that we will be recognizing in the future. So all this information can also be summarized in the following table, which may be familiar to some of you from previous year's presentations. It can also be found in the valuation report. And I'd like to highlight that far right-hand column, the amount deferred. That 170, 484, negative 249, 329, those are the same green and red gains and losses that we saw from the previous slide. And again, their total is $734 million. And so to calculate the actuarial value of assets, all we're going to do is we're going to start with our market value, the top row, the $12.7 billion, and we're going to deduct out that $734 million in gains. And we're doing that because, again, those gains are being deferred. They'll be recognized in the future, but as of today, we have to deduct them out because, again, they'll be coming down the road. And that's how we get to our actuarial value of $11.97 billion. Okay, so that is the market value and actuarial value for 2018. And our next slide is going to provide a little bit of a look back to those market values and actuarial values over the past decade. Here in the black line, we're showing the market value, and in the green line is the actuarial value. And in my opinion, this slide is really proof that the AVA method is working as intended. You can see that black line tends to be rather jumpy. It's jumping around with market volatility, whereas the green line does a much better job of sort of shooting right through the middle there. It's much more stable and predictable, and that's because we're deferring assets or investment assets rather, and in the long run, we expect that to kind of come close to our assumption of 7.4%. So I guess to recap here, the actuarial value is smoother, and that provides the board with a smoother year-to-year funded status and contribution rate calculation. All right, that's all I have to say about assets for right now. We're now going to move over to the other side of the equation and talk about liabilities. And here we're showing two key liability measures. The first is the present value of future benefits. And all that is if you add up all the benefit payments that we expect to pay to members that are currently in the system and bring that value back to today's value, that's what you get. And then the accrued liability is just the portion of that that has actually been earned by members as of the valuation date. And what you see on the table is that both of those liabilities did increase during this valuation, and that's entirely to be expected. As Mitch mentioned, the system is growing. It's taking on more actives. Those actives are earning higher salaries. It's also seeing more annuitants who are earning larger benefits. And so all that means is, an increase, of course, to the liabilities, but that's to be expected. And so the next logical step, after talking about assets and liabilities, we're going to bring them together, and we're going to talk about funded status. And funded status is one of the most tangible ways of assessing the financial health of a pension system. All we're doing, I know you're all probably very familiar, but for those of you who are not, our funded status is just taking the actuarial value of assets we saw on the prior slide and dividing that number by the accrued or the earned portion of the liabilities. You see, in 2017, the funded status was 109%. In this year's valuation, we're seeing a funded status of 108%. And that slight dip is, again, due to the transfer of assets to the BIA account. If in absence of that BIA transfer, the funded status for 2018 would have been 111%. So it would have continued that upward trajectory that we're accustomed to seeing. And so last, but certainly not least, we have to talk about contribution rates. Again, as a reminder, this is not a rate-setting valuation, so these contribution rates are informational only, but it just kind of lets us keep a finger on the pulse and see what they're doing over the past year. And what we see is that the aggregate rate, that's the underlying contribution rate, and the minimum rate both increased a little bit from last year's valuation. And so let's see why that happens, starting with the aggregate rate. The aggregate rate increased again because of that BIA transfer, so less assets, higher contributions needed by members. And then the second piece is the 2019 legislation that expanded occupational disease presumptions. So both of them kind of combine to that increase in the aggregate rate. Moving over to the minimum rate, you'll see that also increased, but not by as much. And that's because the minimum rate is, it's not really, it doesn't need to account for that BIA transfer. It only needs to account for the legislation change. So that's why the increase wasn't as much to the minimum rate. So I know we threw a lot of information at you. To recap what we've talked about, we saw that the annuitant growth did outpace the active membership growth, which was as expected as the plan matures. We saw that investments returned more than expected, but the BIA transfer did reduce the LEF2's fund assets. And that reduction in fund assets did cause the funded status to decrease slightly from last year. And we also saw that the contribution rates increased under both the aggregate cost method and the minimum contribution rate policy when compared to last year's valuation. And as a reminder, Mitch mentioned it at the top, but the actuarial valuation is a snapshot in time measurement. In this case, it's as of June 30th, 2018. And as of that point in time, the Left Plan 2 pension fund is considered to be financially healthy. So that's the recap of this year's valuation. We next want to provide you just a little bit of a sneak peek into what you can expect next year. So next year will be a rate-setting valuation, which forms the foundation for the contribution rates that the board will be adopting for the 21-23 biennium. That valuation will also include the demographic experience study, and that's where we're looking at assumptions like mortality, retirement, and termination. The results of that experience study will be coming to the board next year, and you'll be adopting those demographic assumptions next year. And then, as always, when we have a rate-setting valuation, that valuation undergoes an external audit. So that will be happening, and the audit will also extend to that demographic experience study as well. And then the final item is OSA is always looking to provide new education, new information to the board and to the public as a whole. And so because of that, we're looking forward to potentially providing some new information on our website next year. I'd like to take, just with my last two slides, a very brief segue and kind of highlight some of that information that is on our website. It'll be quick, I promise. And so here, this is our lovely homepage. And the middle bottom tile, which is a picture of Mitch walking the tightrope, that took us several takes to get, that is our commentary on risk webpage. And you may recall Matt Smith, the state actuary, gave a presentation to the board a couple months ago where he talked about some of the risks that are impacting the pension system. All that information is summarized in that webpage. Right now, it is looking at the DRS retirement systems as a whole, but next year, we're looking to make that plan specific. So Left2 would potentially be able to go in and see the risks that are impacting their individual plan. And then I saved the biggest table for last, and this is our historical data table. And this is for the left system, both Plan 1 and Plan 2. And this is just giving a historical look back of everything we talked about today. The contribution rates for employers, state, and members, the funded status, the assets, the number of annuitants and active members, investment returns, all of that is on our website. Here we're just showing the past 4 years, but the board and the public can go on our website and find the past 10 years. So For data nerds like me, it is interesting to go back and kind of see the trends and how the Left 2 plan has evolved over the past decade. Mitch and I are happy to follow up with any additional information about our website after the board meeting. But as for right now, if there are any further questions, we're happy to take them.
Questions for Frank? All right. Thank you very much. Steve?
We are slightly ahead of schedule. With the board's concurrence and approval, we have some members in the audience who showed up for agenda item 10, an update on the benefit improvement account. And with your approval, we could move that up in the agenda and do that part of do the update now, if that would work for you. And then where things stand on the benefit improvement account, there's a couple of two trends that I want to address. One, ever since the passage of the legislation creating the benefit improvement account, there's been a great deal of interest among the stakeholders, plan members, about what it's going to be spent on. And so the stakeholder groups in particular just recently conducted a survey of all of their participants about kind of what's your demographic situation? Are you active, retired, how much service, police, fire? And then where are your preferences on any distribution of the benefit improvement account? The survey was recently completed, and the general, I won't say that they've reached any final conclusions at all, but the general consensus from the data was that the people who participated in the study, and there was a statistically significant number of responses, the consensus was to include retired members in whatever benefit was whatever benefit is purchased with the benefit improvement account, to include retirees in there to some extent. They want some fairness there for retirees. The next step then for the board would be to develop a series of options for next consideration, next interim, that would meet that sort of general goal. And the idea is come up with probably at least 3 different types of approaches with pros and cons for each that would include retirees. Even though the people who participated in the study understood that including retirees might mean a smaller benefit for everybody overall, but retirees would get something as well. So that is kind of the status of the survey and the plans for the next interim with respect to the board and the benefit improvement account. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was sort of rumor control, and I talked to some of the stakeholder groups about this as well last week. We'll try to get some stuff out on our website and in our next newsletter, and hopefully the stakeholder groups, to the extent that they communicate with their members, can reinforce the same thing. But we've been getting a lot of questions and or emails from plan members saying things like, I understand that there's going to be an increase in the multiplier from 2 to 2.5, and I'm trying to figure out whether I should retire or not, because I don't want to retire and miss out on that. And so there's 2 pieces to that. One is the timing. There is no expectation among the stakeholder groups or the boards that there's going to be any legislation this upcoming session. So the soonest that anything will be spent out of the benefit improvement account right now, the plan is that that'll be a 2021 legislative session bill. Whatever it is, it will include retirees. Now, the next part about whatever it is, $300 million in the benefit improvement account sounds like a lot of money, but as you just saw from the actuarial valuation, the plan is a $13 billion plan. There is no possibility of being able to fund a multiplier increase of 2.5 with the benefit improvement account. And so one of the things that we might do to help control the rumors is get some specifics out there, for instance, of what would 300 million buy. We've been reluctant to do that because we don't want to get out in front of you guys and look like we're trying to suggest how to spend the money. And also, it's preliminary, and so by the time you get to the 2021 session, the numbers could be slightly different, and we don't want to create a false expectation. But I think it's fair to say, to give you a rough idea of kind of the scale of what we're talking about. Currently, if you had a current benefits, it's 2% per year of service. If you were to increase the multiplier and spend the 300 million, it's very rough, but the type of improvement that you'd be talking about then would be an increase from 2 to maybe 2.2 for years 16 through 25 only. So your first 15 years are still 2%. Your years from 25 on are still 2%, and that would be prospective only. So that type of pricing wouldn't even account for the retirees. Now that we know the plan is, or the general consensus is, to include something for retirees, you can see that the whatever that benefit improvement is, it's likely to be fairly modest. It's definitely not something that should be, especially since retirees are going to be included, it's not something that should affect your decision to retire or not. You're going to have, you're going to have a lot more things that are going to affect your pension or your retiree monthly income, health care, et cetera, to a greater extent than this BIA distribution. We'll try to get some information out that's available that'll help manage those expectations. This has been one of those things where a lot of rumors got fired up and they get spread really quickly. When you're talking about pensions, particularly big increases in pensions, and some people have been saying, I heard we're going to get a 3% multiplier, and so very dramatic increases have been rumored. And we want to, if it's really affecting plan member behavior, if you've got people thinking that I don't want to retire because I don't want to miss out on something that's going to affect my pension by $500 a month, and then they find out, no, it's actually going to affect your pension by like $10 a month, that's the kind of thing that you don't want them to delay retirement over. So we'll work on getting some information out. The current plan is to begin bringing some options to the board for your consideration in the 2020 interim, with that leading to potential legislation in 2021, which would mean it would probably start affecting pensions no sooner than July of 2021. And I don't know if are there any questions from board members on this? We didn't have anybody sign up to testify on this as well. So if there's nobody that wanted to testify, then that would conclude the update on the benefit improvement account and kind of give you an idea of the next steps. All right. The next item on the agenda was the administrative update, but it might make more sense to duck into some of Jacob. We can usually do the administrative update while you guys are getting lunch. Lunch is ready. It's a little bit early, but if you want to take an early lunch, we could let you get lunch now and start the administrative update, say at 11:20, and I could do that while you're eating.
Yeah, I think that we'd like to do that. Let's go ahead and
All right,
move towards that.
that'll
Thank
be
you.
the plan.
All right, thanks, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get back into our meeting with Steve going into our administrative update. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get back into the regular meeting, keep you guys on track, get you out, looks like we'll get you out a little bit early. With respect to the administrative update, there's 5 or 6 items I wanted to let you know. Outreach, Tim did a presentation to Bellingham firefighters at their local in October. We don't have any outreach scheduled between now and the next meeting. The Select Committee on Pension Policy had meetings in October and November, and there's been no change in the status of coordinated issues. So the Select Committee has moved out the exact same month of death bill that you guys have moved out, and we'll be working with them in terms of coordination. Are they technically the bill from last session, which is identical, is still alive? So is the intent to use those bills, even though the Senate sponsor for the Senate companion is no longer in the Senate? I don't know if that's going to lead to a new Senate bill being dropped or not, but we'll coordinate all of that with the Select Committee. Similarly, though, they have not added the interrupted military service credit fix to their work plan, so there's no expectation that they're going to do that this session. And the issue that you'll be talking about here in a little bit later today, the survivor option election issue was another one that we notified them that you were working on that could apply to the other plans, and that has also not been added to their work plan for this interim. So there's no expectation that if you move forward on that, that it would be in coordination with the Select Committee. The Pension Funding Council. As you may recall, when Matt, or when the Office of the State Actuary released their economic study earlier, the recommendations for LEF 2 were no change. We're already at the recommended assumptions in Matt's report. That's not true for the other plans in the state. And so the Pension Funding Council was considering lowering the long-term earnings assumption to 7.4, which is what the actuary recommended and which would match what you guys are doing. They did not vote to do that. That's, of course, there's still a possibility something like that could happen in legislation, but realistically, that means the state will not be changing their long-term earning assumption in this 2-year period. The board, I've given you a couple of different updates on whether or not we're moving. As you'll recall, I told you when the interim started that we'd been notified by the State Investment Board that they needed our space for expansion, and so we were going to be looking to move out within the next year. Then in communications with OFM and with the State Investment Board, it was determined there really wasn't a need for SIB to expand this year. And so that kind of pushed back the date when we would need to move. We moved forward with a budget package that was based on the idea that we would be moving probably in January of 2021. And we've been working with OFM to get approval on that moving forward. Not quite there, but I think realistically we're probably within just a day or two from getting that approval. So moving forward, we would be working with Department of Enterprise Systems, their real estate division. They would help us identify new locations that would meet our needs. Target date, again, of moving is January 2021, maybe that first 6 months of 2021. But the key thing is next year, next interim, for your work, expect it to still be here and in this boardroom, and our offices would be in the same location next year. So we might have we might be meeting someplace else in 2021, but at least for next interim, I think we're pretty locked into it being here. That 2021 date might be a little bit flexible depending on whether something's opening up a little sooner or a little later, but it won't affect the boardroom or affect you guys. Are there any questions about the move? I know it's been all over the board, all interim long. It's kind of been quite a back and forth, but are you guys all comfortable with where we're at as far as what's happening? Okay. With respect to the administrative items, that's the biggest thing. So we'll be moving forward with the budget package on the move. It might be slightly modified. I'm not quite sure how that'll work. The approval from OFM is likely to be for a little bit lower square footage than what our budget package was based on. You're not going to get the gold-plated toilets. I think we're finally, the approval process took a lot longer than I expected, but like I said, I think we're just about done with that. That is all that I had for the administrative update. Are there any questions about any of those issues or anything else administratively before we get back into the research topics? Okay. On the agenda, the next item that we had was a funding work session. What that is it's kind of a carryover from the October meeting. So those of you who were at the October meeting will remember there was a presentation by OSA that showed some. Tim, can you help me out by coming up and running the slideshow for this next one? So the presentation by OSA in October gave you guys an example of what a type of funding policy that could work to kick in if you, with a trigger of 110%. That was just an example. Last year when we were working on this funding policy and we were talking about corridors and what would be a trigger, the input from the board was we want that number to kind of be mathematically based. Work with OSA to come up with something that's mathematically based. So that first presentation was kind of the first attempt to give you some real numbers around a real option that 110% trigger with the action that would come in would be moving to a 90% floor. What would that look like to rates, and what would that look like to the planned funded status expected moving forward? Now, at that point in time, then the board discussion kind of morphed from talking about the trigger point, or talking about, the way I try to couch it is, how much of a reserve is reasonable? The goal this session was that you guys would come up with a actuarial cost method, whether that's the one you've got or a new one, and associated funding policies that would allow us to explain to the legislature how you're setting rates, and in particular, how you're taking into account the current funded status of LEF 2 with your rate setting. One of those questions is, if you're going to leave a reserve, how much of a reserve do you feel is reasonable, so that we could talk about that then with the legislature. That's still the goal, to have you adopt a policy in December so that we have that going into session. And so as a follow-up for today, the first thing I wanted to show you is the next. This is what OSA showed you at the October meeting of what would happen to the funded status and what would happen to the aggregate contribution rate moving forward if you do nothing. And so you see by 2024, those deferred gains that were pointed out in the actuarial valuation report. You've got $700 and some million in deferred gains. Those would be recognized. That would push the funded ratio up from where it currently is at 108 to about a little over 116. And then moving up in the future to potentially 124%. That's what you would expect if you did nothing. On the next slide, OSA gave an explanation of their approach that they were going into. The idea is, under current policy, you set the rates based on the normal cost of the plan, the normal cost component of the entry age normal cost method, and you leave it there. Under the proposal, if you hit a funded ratio of 110%, or I shouldn't say proposal, more example, if you hit a funded ratio of 110%, if you use that as the trigger, then the rates would drop down to 90%. And if the funded ratio continued to improve after that, maybe you had really strong investment returns, and you ended up getting up to 115% funded even after lowering rates, then you could lower the rates a little bit further to 80% of the normal cost, and so on. So that was the alternate policies that the OSA used. In the next slide, this was the one example that they brought forward for October, specifically using 110% as that initial trigger, what you saw on the last slide. At 110%, you'd go down to 90. And if the funded ratio continued to improve, you'd get a little bit more aggressive with those rate reductions. The projections that you see there show the black line is what would happen if you did nothing. That was from that first slide of what you did, what would it look like to the funded ratio if you did nothing. The other two lines, the green and the yellow, were those two policies about how aggressive you were going to get in responding when you hit 110%. They had those policies beginning in 2023 because you've got rates adopted until then. Representative Berquist?
And it looks like it's assuming a 7.4 return over time.
Yes.
Is there, some of this projections, they show kind of what happens if we're a percent below, a percent above. Do we have anything like that for this?
We've got a little bit coming up, but in not quite that example, but some things similar. One of the pieces that the actuary talked about, you've got a number of policies in place already to deal with what happens if you have bad investment experience. So you've got a lot of policies to protect you on the bottom end. If funding goes in, decreases, how do you protect the plan in that situation? You've got a lot of things. Where the discussion needs to kind of be focused, where you guys are going to have to make a decision by December, is what are you going to do on the top end? So as you can see, the 110% trigger with the 90% floor gradually getting more aggressive if the funded ratio continues to improve. That's that green line. It would take, if you're expected to hit 116% in 2023, you can see you stay pretty much there. You maybe dip down to 115, slightly under 115, but even projected out into the future, that approach just keeps you where you're at. It levels things off a little bit, but it doesn't really push things back in any significant way to get you back towards 100. Similarly, that now if you look at the yellow line, which was a more aggressive approach at that 110% trigger, that does start pushing things down. But you'll see even under that method, you're still at about 112%. You're going to be over 110% funded. You're at 108 now under either of those two options projected, and that's carrying things out for a significant period of time. Pat?
Thanks, Steve. This chart here, I missed the October meeting because I had a family trip, but going back, what the chart we're looking at right now, this is with a rate of return of 7.4% on our.
Yes.
One of the things I want to go back to the past.
Okay.
Once things start dumping.
Yes.
And once we start making adjustments, saying, okay, we have too much in this fund, so let's review the rates and say the assumed rate of return will be 9% or something like that. Everybody gets a vacation on contribution rates because they drop and stuff like that. When the markets go bad.
Yes.
That's the hardest time to try and increase contribution rates to make it safe. Governments, entities, all get nervous, and even if they do have to increase that, if it's a mandate to increase it, then we start losing employees.
Yes.
Then we start dumping.
So and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the issues that we've been trying to address. I'm talking staff working with OSA, that you guys have brought up as board members now for over a year. And what I'm hoping that is clear from this chart is that if you use 110% as your trigger and you use these kind of gradually increasing rate reductions, that is not a dump, to use your words, in the rates. That's a modest approach to the funded ratio, and as you can see, it kind of has a modest impact. Under this scenario, now this is based on 7.4, and I'll show you something else right after this, but based on that, the most you're going to see is that 116 going down to maybe 113. Okay, so by no stretch is that a dump in rates that's likely to create a concern about rates going up in the future. One of the things that came up in the October meeting that I asked the actuary to follow up on, there were two takeaways from the October meeting. One, what would things look like if we had a repeat of the Great Recession, the absolute worst case bottom falling out scenario? And similarly, what would it look like if you took this exact same concept, but instead of doing 110% trigger, you used 105% as a trigger? In a sense, what that's saying is instead of 10% being a reasonable reserve, if you will, we'll call 5% a reasonable reserve. And once we get over that, we'll start taking, again, modest steps, not a dump, but some modest steps to at least try to keep that from growing more. Maybe not reducing it much, but at least keep it from growing more. And next slide, Tim. This is how things would look like under keeping everything the same, except instead of using 110% as the trigger, what would it look like if you used 105? You'll see the same kind of thing that they are projecting they're not projecting anything to kick in until 2023 because you've got rates adopted until then. By that time, all those deferred gains are going to be on the books, and you're going to be looking at roughly 116% funded, depending on investment returns. You can now see that kind of light green line, if that kicked in, you'd still end up with an ultimate funded ratio of about over 110. So even moving the trigger from 110% to 105% really doesn't push things down under, as far as the funded ratio. That's still it projects to keep it from growing, but it's only going to drop by a total, it'll still be over 110%. Now, the second option, which was the slightly more aggressive rate reductions, again, not a dump, but more aggressive rate reductions, would bring you down. It would at least get you down under 110. It's the only option so far that you've seen that would actually kind of push down your funded ratio over time. In particular, over the short term, like say if you look on here from 2023 to 2028, I guess, in that 5-year period, you see it getting it down to maybe 112, like from 116 to 112, and it would continue to push it down over time. But ultimately, you still end up at, what is that, 109? Which is right where you're at now. So even with this plan, your funded ratio, it would go up as those deferred gains would be recognized, and then it would go down as these rate reductions kicked in over time, these modest rate reductions. But you would see even over the next 20 years, you're going to end up projected to end up right where you're at now at a 108, 109% funded. Okay, questions about this before we move on to the next slide showing the Great Recession?
Yes.
Because I want to make sure you guys capture that you understand sort of these concepts before we throw too many things at you and it all gets jumbled together.
Well, the good news is I haven't glazed over yet.
Okay.
So, question on these numbers, on these contribution rates, we know that we have set contribution rates that are being come from the state, come from the employer, come from the employee. And then on top of that, we have asset gains.
Yes.
Right. And so through these numbers and these various slides, the question that I always come up with, and I'm often asked, is those contributions are made. That's a determinative sum. And then on top of that, there's monies that are made from investments.
Yes.
And are these numbers because as we heard earlier, when Representative Berquist was talking about smoothing on the asset gains versus the contributions, are all these numbers just being lumped together?
Yes, so
When we're
this,
talking about
this is
these.
assuming 7.4%, which means no asset gains, no asset losses. You're getting exactly what you were projected. So you're projected, if 7.4 gets you $1 billion in gains that year, that's what you're projected to get, is that billion. We know asset gains and losses are going to occur during this time period. This just gives you sort of a baseline of what to expect using 7.4 as that baseline. The actual path, in other words, is not going to be nearly as smooth as you see on this chart. The smoothing will help with that. But realistically, if you earn 7.4 on average over the next 20 plus years, it might be slightly more bumpy than this, but it's not going to be very different from this. You'll see the actual path would match what you're looking at under that green and blue. So that's the numbers that this is based on. Earning 7.4 on average as expected. The problem that you've got, and it's a good problem to have, but the problem that you've got is for the last 10 years, you've earned much more than 7.4% on average. If you'd earned 7.4% on average for the last 10 years, you'd be right around 100% funded. But we've had the longest sustained market run-up in history, and that has created this situation now where your funding is at 108, 109, projected to hit 116. You are going to have to, I am going to have to be able to explain to legislators how that happened and what you're doing about it, and why. That's the goal of the discussion today, and in particular, the action that you'll be taking in December, is to be able to answer those questions. What are you doing and why? And it could be nothing. We're doing whatever. I'm not trying to say that there's an answer for December, but we're throwing some options at you, building on the discussion from last year, which was around those corridors. So this is new today, and this would kind of show you using 105% as the trigger for you to kick in rate reductions, what it would look like, what would happen to the rates, and what would happen to the funded ratio over time. So this is an example of a possible policy that you could adopt in December. Today, we're just throwing it out, getting your reactions, getting your questions, and we'll be bringing more stuff back for you in December to adopt. Okay?
As a point of information, as we move forward, I'd like everybody also to consider what we just did with the BIA, where we had the budget being met when we had prior, where we were there's supposed to be a $25 million contribution, and that hasn't happened, but because of the good investment strategies and the fortunate position we found ourselves in, we were able to utilize those monies through legislation for a benefit improvement account. So moving forward in the future, I don't know what the status is of whether or not we're going to get contributions from the legislature or not. So,
well, the bill last year repealed the benefit improvement account, that funding. So there's no expectation of getting any further contributions from the legislature. To the extent that there are discussions about making another transfer out of left 2 into the benefit improvement account, those would take into account the health of the plan. But right now, there's no expectation of getting any more money from the legislature into the BIA. Pat?
Steve, from the employer side, this is one of the things that we're always looking at.
Yeah.
You know, and it's I'm in a fire district, so I look at the age of our employees and what goes on, and the idea as we look at what's going on, firefighters are going, and I believe police officers are in the same situation, is that without having any type of health care insurance, they're going to hang on as long as they can because they want to try and get to 65 to where they get to Medicare. And nobody wants a 65-year-old firefighter or police officer running around if not necessary. It creates a big problem for me as an employer due to the fact that after you hit age 50, 53, people start getting hurt. The L&I claims themselves are 3 times as much as any type of health care insurance would cost to have that employee out. So what I see going on in this type of situation is that this board, this legislature, this group has done an excellent job on securing the contribution rates and making everybody aware of this is what it costs to run an organization. And we've had great returns. We've got a great investment board. They do a great job on investing the monies. We haven't ended up in a situation like California, Kentucky, or some of these other places that we heard back in New Orleans on a 41% rate in their funds. I'm saying all that to say, as we move forward, I want to make sure we always talk about the Great Recession. I was there in 2001 when the tech disaster happened, and everything bottomed out. Everybody thought that was going to be the ultimate, this is kill all.
Yeah.
And we started getting worried. We all know what it takes to fund a pension plan. And in my group, I have to look out for kind of like anybody else as an employer. What you try to do is manage your risks. And some of the times you're looking at your risks to make sure that you've got the money in there, that you don't start stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we'd like to see as a group is to make sure that we are happy with the contribution rates that we have to make today. We don't want to all of a sudden get something spiked in 5 years that costs us losing employees. And so as we go forward, one of the best things we can do is see how the BIA, and one of the things we look at is that that's a benefit improvement account. That may not mean a multiplier. That may not mean a lump sum payment to me. That might be some way of starting an healthcare trust fund that would allow people a certain amount of money to get that when they retire. Because as we have people retire, they're at the top of the salary, they've got longevities, most of them, they're going to get, they're injury prone. If we get them out of the mix and hire newer people, the contribution rates, they're less salaries, they're less apt to get hurt. So this is a long diatribe to say, I'm okay with what we're trying to do, but as an employer that has to manage risk, I see this, and I also see I've got the money to pay for it as it is now.
Yeah.
But to
Well-
get a pig in a poke, that would scare me. I'm okay with the information coming forward that this would work, but I'm not comfortable with it yet.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And Tim, if you could go back to that slide that showed back a couple more, that one, showing the minimum rates. To give you kind of an example of what we're talking about in terms of rate reductions, which would also then, the flip side of that is if things go sideways and the funded ratio now drops below 100, and we have to increase rates back up to the normal cost, what we're talking about. It's a little bit hard to see here, but you can, if you look at that top line, the current policy line that's flat. Okay, so under this, the first step would be kicking it down to 90% of that. So your member rates would go from roughly 8.5 to about 7 3/4, I think, something along those lines. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's roughly around that. So that's what you're talking about in that first step. For the employers, you pay, you don't pay all of that 7.5. Yeah, and that includes the right now that 8.5 is split between the employer and the state at about 5 and 3.5. So for the employers, maybe you're going down from 5 to 4.5. I'm just throwing out rough numbers here. And that's the idea of your potential risk then of a bump up, is that you lower it to 4.5 and now you got to raise it back up to 5, and where you're going to come. Yeah, or potentially, but that's the scale. So we're talking again, total, we're talking about less than 1% of pay. These are not, what I want to avoid is the perception that this is in any way like the Happy Valley, like the rate cuts, the dramatic rate cuts that took place after 2001 and the mid-2000s, where all the plans, including Left 2, were, the rates were artificially depressed to unsustainable limits. What you see here is, if you go back to the next couple of slides again, Tim, these are not unsustainable rate cuts. In fact, they're totally sustainable. They have the intended effect of at least keeping the contribution of the funded ratio from getting higher. And under the most aggressive proposals, they could still decrease it slightly over time. But even then, the amount that we're talking about, these are not dramatic rate cuts, and they're in fact sustainable rate cuts. And this gets back to the bottom end protections that I was trying to talk about early. It's very understandable for board members and participants to worry about the kind of what happens in the bad situations. I'll talk about the worst case scenario next, but you have a number of protections on the bottom end to increase rates at any time that you need to. When the board first increased rates, you did it annual with gradual step-ups to make it easier for members and employers to manage, and all you got out of the Happy Valley with those types of policies without losing employees, without creating problems for employers. So you'll be you'll have a number of tools to manage bad news. The challenge that you're facing right now is you don't have any tools to manage good news, and that's the piece that I don't want you to lose focus of. That's the challenge before you, is you've got to figure out how you want to manage good news. Now, and one of the options will be, we don't want to do anything because we don't think the good news is going to last forever, and we want to have as much in the bank as possible. Representative Berquist?
I get the sense that if we take that stance, the legislature might want to take a different stance.
Yes,
And
that's
something that we need to take into account.
That's the risk. And right now, I'll be honest, the board, you guys you're going to, it's a challenge. You're going to have to reach consensus on this, or that's at least the ask, is that you reach, because I know we've got board members right now that run from leave it totally alone because I think there's going to be another big recession and I want as much there to cushion that as possible, to board members who are like, I don't want to use it for rate reductions, I want to use it for benefit improvements. And that's a completely separate discussion. To, we need to, so there's all kinds of different opinions on the boards, both about how to manage it and what is the risk of having another great recession. Wolf?
Thank you. Couple quick things. It's hard for us to remember to work on averages. When we're assuming an investment rate of return of 7.4, we're not assuming we're going to get that every year. It's averaged. So it's averaged over a long period of time looking back and then applied looking forward. So 7.4 already has in it 2017's 14%, but it'll also have in it some historical zeros and negatives. So it's already assuming ups and downs. So in any given year, you could see a down. But the question is, does that cause you to do something? And that sort of relates to the other side of this, is that I think of these models, and I think of this situation as having an enormously powerful gear reduction in it. You got to turn the crank a lot of times on any one side for that gear reduction to move anything very far. In October, we heard a little bit of that from the actuary in doing what they call sort of stress testing and modeling on any of the assumptions. And it's just really, really hard, given their Monte Carlo modeling, to move any of the numbers from anywhere you set them, as long as we're judicious and responsible in what we set and play towards stability. There's a lot of room to make some policy choices here that are all very safe. But we have to keep thinking in terms of averages and the kinds of mechanisms that we're actually manipulating. Because what feels like we're turning something really fast is actually not turning things much at all, because there's so much power required in order to move these numbers around.
I appreciate that, because I think that's what this chart is showing you here. You're at 108, 109% funded now. Even using 105% trigger with the most aggressive reductions in 20 years, you're going to be at 108 or 109% funded, projected.
Not here to argue.
Okay.
Probably dropped 5,000 points.
And the markets have rebounded, and you're at a historic highs right now. That's what I'm saying, the ups and downs. So, yes. So the next, now, before we move on, Tim, what I want you to take away from this piece is, because you'll see this again next month, is this a reasonable target, reasonable response for you to adopt? There'll still be plenty of other options to do other things over and above this, both in worst-case scenarios and with respect to benefit improvements. But it's taking the benefit improvements out of this discussion. If you were to set a policy for how you are going to manage good news, is this a reasonable policy? For instance, it gets you back to where you are, but it takes 20 years. Do you want to see something more aggressive than this? If not, we'll bring this back as one of the options for you to consider in December. And this would be something then that we would have information to explain to legislators and legislative staff about what we looked at, what you did, why you did it, and the projected effects of doing that. If you're okay with where we're at on this option, we can move on to some of the other questions.
If you don't mind, I just had a question, a point of clarification about what exactly the alternatives are here. Does this incorporate a negative reversion trigger too, such that if it drops to 109%, it goes back up to the old level? Or is this only a one-way? No. Where are the triggers for the reverses? I guess it's just a point of clarification.
The triggers are every time the board sets rates. So you'll look at the funded ratio every time the board sets rates every 2 years, and the rates would be based on where your funded ratio is at that time.
Thank you.
And then, and again, this is a policy, so it's subject to change. You adopt rates, you can deviate from your policy. The rates currently are lower than your policy would dictate because of your positive funded area right now. You saw that in you're about 8 basis points. The adopted rates are about 8 basis points lower than the normal cost. You're already doing something to a modest extent to recognize your funded status in rates. This would be more putting it into policy so that there's something that can be explained what you're doing to manage good news, if you will. If we're all okay before I move on, I don't want to leave anybody behind on this because you won't see it again until December, we can start talking to the worst, the bottom case scenarios. What happens? And we've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months talking about what the bottom case scenarios are. Because of that, I asked the actuary to, if you could show the next slide, what would things look like if you had another Great Recession? Now, there's a couple of things I want to share with you, especially to the extent that we're explaining this to legislative staff. Most economists right now would agree that the likelihood of another Great Recession here is like in the 1% to 2% area. So it's challenging to use that as your basis. You can use that, and for instance, if your policy is, if we're explaining it to the legislature, we want to say, hey, we want to make sure the plan stays whatever, 100% funded, even if there's a Great Recession. Then the question will be, well, how reasonable is it to use that as your trigger, if you will? But again, the top line is if you do nothing, that dotted line that stays level, that runs through the middle of the graph, is the normal cost. As you recall, the normal cost of the plan, that's that doesn't change based on investment returns. So that's a very stable number, and if you did nothing, that's what your rates would look like over the next 20 years. Now, what you see with the red line there, the red lines, the dotted red line and the big solid red line, the solid red line is what your funded ratio would look like if you had another Great Recession, and if you responded to it by just leaving things at the normal cost. In other words, you just kept paying that regular normal cost, and the impact is a little bit like what you might expect. When you get over 100%, which is where you are now, and you leave rates set at the normal cost, then you're expected to see your funded ratio continue to grow over time, and the projection showed hitting 124. In a Great Recession scenario, the funded ratio would dip below 100. You can see it bottoming out, in fact, I want to say somewhere around 83% in 2027, when all of those losses, smoothed out losses, would finally be recognized. That would cause rates to go above where they're at now, that dotted yellow line. And in fact, you would see the contribution rates hitting a high somewhere out in 2030, roughly, of about 13%. Okay, so beginning in 2023 and headed upwards from then, you would see that's that dotted red line mountain climbing up, and those steps, those every 2 years when the board sets rates. That's what those kind of steps reflect. That's the worst case scenario. Representative Bergquist.
Thanks. So what is that assuming? Is that like over the next 20 years, a 5% return? Do you know what that number is?
It's assuming the exact same thing that happened in the Great Recession, which was negative
but over
8
20, but
followed
what was it over?
by 0 or something, the exact same returns. I can't remember off the top of my head what those numbers were, but it essentially over 2 years, we were falling about 40% short of where we, instead of positive 16, we were at negative 24, if I remember right.
So just to confirm, we actually modeled what happened in the Great Recession, which was, I think, a negative 1 point something one year, negative 22 something the next year. And then we also included the bounce back. So we included that whole period that we kind of refer to as the Great Recession. And then after that, it's 7.4. Yes.
So maybe it's 6% over this 20 years we're looking at, or do we know?
I don't think we have that, what it averaged over that whole period. We could get that for you, but we don't have it. And just one more point of clarification since I'm up here. The red dotted line, if we had a Great Recession, that would be your rate because it now exceeds your minimum rate. So if you didn't change your policy, you would be following that minimum rate until that red dotted line went above it, and then that would actually be your contribution rate path, because the aggregate rate would say, hey, we dropped below 100% funded status, we got to get you back, and so we're going to bump up your rates to get you back, because the minimum rate wouldn't be enough at that point. So that's what's happening in this graph, if that's helpful.
Yeah. So this is, again, this is the worst case scenario. This would be like the 1 or 2% likelihood if you're tracking the economists. And the consequence of that worst case scenario is all of your current cushion is spent, and you end up having to increase rates from roughly 8.5 to roughly 13 until until that begins to take effect and get that. Pat.
I don't mean to back up on you, Steve, but the chart that we saw before with the 90%, that's what we're going to be looking at next month.
Next month, yes.
And that's what we want to try between the 80 and the 90. That's something that we need to get to the legislature before this next year, so we have a plan for when we are doing great.
Yes, or you go to them and tell them we don't have a plan and here's why.
How
But
does
yes,
that work usually?
Not well.
No, not well.
Yes.
Okay.
But yes, and so this is sort of like the worst case risk that you and that would be balanced. You obviously, if you even if you do nothing, this risk doesn't go away. Changing the policy doesn't have any effect on the likelihood of a Great Recession. It would have a modest effect on the amount of cushion that you would have to deal with a Great Recession, but nothing is going to deal with it other than rate increases, and you would be in charge of determining how and when those rate increases would take place. Wolf?
Thank you. At risk of wearing out our welcome with the State Actuary's Office, one of the things we do in forecasting sales tax at Pierce County is to try to model what recessions we know about. And that for us tends to be the experience, the lived experience of some of us aging forecasters. So we think about 81, 83, steep drop in, fast bounce out, which up to the Great Recession was the worst we'd ever seen. Yeah, surprise. And then 91, 93, kind of modest in, modest out. 01, 2, and 3, more moderate, average to severe. And then, of course, the Great Recession, which dwarfs everything. It's just completely different scale. So it's plausible, I think, if again, I'm watching for flying things coming my way by asking this, that you could model a couple of different versions of recession here based on reasonable experience, like 81, 83. I'd do 81, 83 and 91, 93, pegging the range along with this. And that gives us a little bit more context, because I go back to your original opening point. The likelihood of this one happening again within our projected lifetimes as we look forward is very, very low. But the likelihood of an 81, 83, or 91, 93 happening again, pretty much 3 of them are going to happen, 4 are going to happen in this time period, up and down of that scale. So it could give us something to think about that's a little bit more reflective. And then to underscore that, part of what we can do then is talk about how we analyze this as we approach legislative staff, OFM, and members who have questions about this. Yeah, we have looked at this. Here's how we've tested it. Here's how we look at the numbers and why we are where we are. What we're doing is reflective of the analysis that's been done. I think that gives us some strength in analytics, but also some strength in research and some basis for communicating how we're looking at ourselves and how we're looking at the status of the plan overall going forward.
Well, that's a great suggestion, and I'll see what is possible to bring back to you in December, kind of showing this some of the other more likely recession scenarios. Yeah, Lisa's Canadian. Lisa's Canadian, so she's very polite, and she's never going to throw anything at anybody. But I will talk with them and find out what is possible to bring back to you in December to model some other recession scenarios. Again, don't lose track of the point. The plan, both because of your current funded status and because of your policies, your plan is already well situated to deal with bad news. You just don't have any plan right now to deal with good news. All right. Tim, if you could show the next slide, please. The other question, it's completely unrelated, but came up at October and earlier when Matt was talking about the plan maturing. One of the maturity measures is when do your benefit payments, or how do your benefit payments compare to your contributions coming in? And what you see is we're actually close to hitting that maturity marker. Benefit payments right now are less than contributions coming in. You get more cash in contributions every year than you pay out in benefits. So in addition to investment returns, you're getting gains from those contributions as well that are pushing up the size of the fund. But that will tip sometime between 2020 and 2021, and the plan will at least become mature. This is probably a similar time frame for all the other Plan 2-3 systems. This is the numbers that you see here. They're not alarming. They're not anything to be concerned about. They're a natural consequence of a plan aging. There's something that the State Investment Board is being aware of to help them understand. They track all this. They get this from OSA. They build it into their asset allocation models to make sure they've got the type of assets that allow enough cash to be on hand to pay the benefit improvements. Over the long term of the plan, if we're looking out at 2028, for instance, it may mean that the SIB is not going to be investing as much in illiquid assets. They're going to have more assets that either generate cash or that can be easily converted into cash to pay benefit improvements. And so that 7.4% might be adjusted in the future, and that's something that Matt talked about as well in his economic study, is that the current asset allocation in private equity is something that may change over time, also because private equity may not generate historically the returns that it's, but yeah. And so both because of the fact that private equity may not be generating the same returns and because it's it doesn't fit well if you need to have more liquid cash on hand, that may adjust that asset allocation in the future. But again, this is more an informational item. It's not a action or concern for either Left 2 or for the commingled trust fund. But this was something that you asked for, and I didn't know the answer. So got OSA to do this for us, to provide that where that maturity level hits. In the future, you heard earlier in the laver, OSA is looking at putting a lot more types of exhibits, especially on their website. Not all of them may go into the written report, but they'll put more stuff on their website that are both maturity measurements and risk measurements. So you'll see more exhibits, even potentially this exhibit, on their website in the future. Now that is all that I have in the case of slides. So before we move on, I want to let you kind of know where we're at leading into December. You've seen kind of some rough ideas of 110% trigger with some rate reductions kicking in, and now today 105% trigger with some rate reductions kicking in. We're going to be asking you to adopt a policy in December with that'll be based on what do you do at the high end? What do you do? How much? A different way of funding it is how much reserve is reasonable. At what point are you going to start taking action in terms of rates to manage your funded ratio? And that will be part of the discussion in December. We'll also be wrapping up the discussions that you've had with Lisa, all interim long, regarding actuarial cost method. Currently use the aggregate method. Do you want to continue with that one, or do you want to switch to the entry age normal cost method? And if you do, what are some of the associated funding policies with that new method that you would also have to adopt? So these are all going to be at you in December, with the idea then that you will have a full comprehensive set of funding policies that can be used to explain what you're doing with rates, why you're doing it, to legislators, legislative staff, plan members, stakeholder groups, anybody who is interested in your actions regarding rate setting. This will all be answered, and it'll all be supported with information from the state actuary on what your decisions are based on. So again, that is for December. I'm telling you that not to scare you away from not showing up at the December meeting. So especially the 6 of you, I expect all of you to be there in December to discuss this further, and we'll have another bunch of options for you to vote on. Okay. Yes.
See, this is kind of a follow-up to earlier. When we say, as you stated, what's a reasonable reserve, and for me is what's determining that reserve, and I keep coming back to, I feel like I'm being punished for having asset gains, and so we've discussed ad nauseum about all the risk associated with the what ifs that might happen, but just about everybody in this room would expect that if they invested money, they'd want an asset gain. That asset gain would be their reserve, and if you're trying to maintain an account based on contributions, the contributions would be set to keep that account at 100%. And the asset gains, for me, and again, maybe I need education or clarification on this, but those asset gains should not come into that equation as far as maintaining the health of that account at 100%. And I don't know if that's an educational component for legislators to understand that we have these gains because when you invest money, you want to make money?
Yes. And so it is educational, and here's kind of the context. I think partly because of when the board was formed and what was going on when the board was formed, rates were being set artificially low to give the state money to take care of other budgetary means. And so in a sense, they were borrowing money from all the pension plans, including Left to use for other state purposes. Because that was going on and it was so systemic and it was so dramatic, there has been an association, particularly among the plan members who were involved in creating this board, that rate reductions are a bad thing. You know, to use your words that you just used, rate reductions are a punishment. Okay, that rate reductions, what the education that I would try to bring in is to think of not rate reductions with any kind of emotional context. Rate reductions are just a tool. They're a tool for you to use to manage your funded ratio. If your funded ratio gets too high, rate reductions are a perfectly normal tool. There are other tools, but they're a normal tool to use that. And in a plan where the members pay 50% of the cost, it works out well because that does put money then into the pocket, at least of the active members. So it's a benefit, if you will, in terms of less, higher monthly take-home pay, if you will, for active members, for employers, and for the state. It doesn't benefit retirees. They don't pay any more contributions, but it is a tool that it doesn't punish members. It actually, to some extent, it gives them a little bit more of their take-home pay. It recognizes the fact of, you got great investment returns. You got investment returns better than what you expected, and as a result, you don't have to quite contribute as much as we expected you to.
Sure, and I understand that perspective. So my and maybe I didn't state this artfully, is it's the perception that you're overfunded, and because you're overfunded, whoever the governing agency want you to do something about it because you're way over 100%. Whereas, well, it may look like we're overfunded, right? And I'm stating that from the perspective that the rates are set properly to meet that 100% ratio, right?
Yeah.
And so because of the asset gains, that pushes you over that 100% ratio. And so now we have to explain, as Representative Berquist said, we have to state to the legislator that, hey, we just can't say we're not going to do something about it, but also the sense that, because these asset gains, that's why we're at the level we are, and whatever that percentage is. But it just seems like our asset gains are getting lumped in to this discussion of overfunded.
No, it's not your asset gains. It's the fact that your asset gains have been way more than you projected for a much longer period of time than anyone expected. So just like on the reverse scenario, if you guys had a recession and you were going back to the legislature and you were saying, our funded ratio is under 100, we're going to have to raise rates. Nobody would say that that's unreasonable. This is the flip side of it. We've had the longest sustained run-up in, we've had a reverse recession, if you will. We've had the longest sustained run-up in history, and as a result, we're going to lower rates for everybody. That's if I would try to give you a context, that's the way to think of it. There are certainly other things that could be done with asset gains. One of the things that you have done, which has worked well to your advantage, is you've adopted all the assumptions that the actuaries recommended, even though some of those assumptions had a cost to the plan. Maybe, and I'm just saying this, maybe if the state had done similar things that you've done in the past, they would be able to use adopt the 7.4 assumption. They wouldn't have quite the same financial disincentive to do it. they could have reasonable reasons perhaps for disagreeing, or I don't want to throw shade at the state, but what I'm saying is you have used the actuary's assumptions all along, and that's actually, now you've got 15 years of history, you can say, look at how that's worked to our advantage. But leaving that aside, the context is not that you're being punished for good gains. The concept is that you've had unusually good gains, and now what do you want to do about that? Keeping some of it for a rainy day, I think, is something that legislators understand. They've had enough rainy days themselves. Whether you think keeping 5% as the trigger is enough, or 10% might be too much, whatever, that's the kind of discussion you're going to have. But that puts it in a context that legislators are used to considering. We've got a plan in place. We're not even going to kick in that plan until we get to 105 or maybe 110. But here's our plan. And then hopefully they would see that as a reasonable response to what has been a historically unprecedented good news situation. If rates had gone the way they were, if investment returns had gone the way they'd been expected to go since 2008, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If rates had gone up and down, and maybe we'd had some little, some off years. We had one bad year that you saw earlier in the laver where returns were lower, but everything other than that has been positive, and the net has been positive. If rates had been closer to that 7.4 average, we'd be right around 100% funded. We wouldn't even be talking about this. It's only because you've had that historically sustained run-up in the market over the last 10 years. You had the worst recession ever, followed by the longest sustained run-up ever. You've had 1 in 100 events, if you will, kind of back to back. But we'll talk about all of that in December. We'll have options for you in December. And another key thing to take away, and we can talk about this more in December, none of this is going to affect any discussions about benefit improvements in any significant way. So, if you're worried that I want to keep as much money in there as possible because maybe I'm hoping to get more money into the benefit improvement account, we're talking about things that aren't even going to, those discussions are going to take place between now and 2024, and none of what you saw today is going to change anything between now and 2024. So those concerns you can set aside. This is just more of a policy moving forward. There's no plan to change rates or deal with anything prior to the rates that you've already adopted. Okay. Are we good moving on to the next topic then? You want to do the calendar adoption then real quick? If we could move to that one, Tim, while we've got a quorum. Well, can you?
I don't have a slide on that.
Okay. In your materials, you were given a handout just today. As the follow-up to the draft calendar that you received earlier, there was concern about the dates in November and December butting up against the holidays. And there was also a conflict that was pointed out with the April date conflicting with the Firefighters Educational Conference. So, to address all three of those concerns, then the April date is moved up to the 15th. The November date is moved to the 18th, and the December date is moved to the 16th. And we received confirmation from the SIB just this morning before the meeting started that those dates are available. So it would be, the motion would be to adopt the dates on the calendar, the dates that you see in yellow on that handout that's in front of you.
Motion to approve.
Mr. Chair, so moved.
All right. We have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Adoption of the calendar for 2020.
The work calendar for the next couple of issues that we were talking about was adopted earlier, so we'll kind of, we can still work off of that, Mr. Chair, as far as the December meeting goes. Item number 8 on the agenda, PEB coverage for catastrophic retirees. Jacob has a follow-up on that. The board had previously showed a work calendar that would have this coming back to you in December. So that would remain the case now, since there's no quorum to vote for anything different. Jacob, if you could, I'll turn it over to you.
For the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. The issue here is Left Plan 2 catastrophic disability retirees and their survivors have different medical insurance access than survivors of members killed in the line of duty. This issue has been brought to the board multiple times over the years, both by catastrophic disability retirees as a possible solution to issues accessing health insurance coverage, and as a question of fairness in comparison to survivors of members killed in the line of duty. And then also by DRS, because tracking and paying a shifting field of individual providers can be burdensome both for them and for the members. And so I've got some more information from them on that later in the presentation. So PEB is the Public Employees Benefit Board, and they purchase and coordinate insurance benefits for eligible public employees and retirees. That includes all state employees. PEB is the largest healthcare provider or healthcare purchaser in the state, which gives them a competitive advantage for providing high-quality options at a lower price. And some left members and retirees currently do have access to PEB through their employer, but that is up to each individual employer.
Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. So is PEB a self-insured operation, or do they buy fully insured options on the market?
I'd have to get back to you on that. I'm not sure. Here are some of the options for members under PEB, and it includes the premium amount. Is that the answer? It's purchased? Yeah, okay. And so there were some questions at the last presentation regarding how much catastrophic retirees are currently paying in premiums versus what's under PEB. And so that's why I provided this slide with some information. And then also I worked with DRS to get some data about what they're currently paying catastrophic retirees. But there were some issues with that data that I'll explain a bit more. But the 2019 average catastrophic disability reimbursement has been $1,284. So that gives you some idea. But one of the issues with that information is I don't know how many, if that was for individual subscribers, subscriber and spouse, subscriber and children. And then also that dollar amount is heavily skewed by who applied for reimbursement in that time period. So I'll get into the difficulties with that a bit later in the presentation. So line of duty death benefit, survivors are covered by PEB and their premiums are paid by Left 2. survivors who not have a choice to get different health care coverage and have those premiums reimbursed by LEF2. And under catastrophic retiree benefit, the retirees have their health care premiums reimbursed by LEF2, and they have, like I said, no access to PEB unless their employer offers PEB. Under this scenario, retirees do have greater choice. However, they may not be able to find options on the open market or through their employer that can compete with PEB. So the administrative process that I mentioned before, that some of the difficulties in data and why DRS had an interest in this proposal. So with the line of duty death survivor, there's no reimbursement process. DRS makes direct payments to Healthcare Authority for the PEB premiums. However, for catastrophic disability retirees, it is a fairly complex reimbursement process, different for each member and depending on their insurance coverage. And some examples of what those difficulties have led to. So there's 4 catastrophic retirees that currently have never received a reimbursement. And when I talked about the data being skewed, an example of that is recently there was a reimbursement for 10 years of premiums. So someone had gone 10 years without making a request for premiums, made that request, and there was a $73,000 payment, which then skews that data. So I asked DRS kind of, when you talk to members, do they give a reason, especially the 4 that have never received a reimbursement? And it's that retirees have told them it's not worth it to them. They don't want to be bothered with more paperwork, that they find the process cumbersome and frustrating. So kind of some information about what that process is. So DRS annually sends catastrophic disability retirees a LEF Plan 2 request for medical premium reimbursement form in November and again in May, and I've included that as an attachment to the documents. The request for reimbursement is submitted for the previous 6 months. However, the retiree can submit more frequently if they want to be reimbursed more frequently or less. There is no time limit on requesting reimbursement. There is one way for members to get out of this cycle of having to request reimbursements again and again, and that's through vendor pay. And so vendor pay is not just for catastrophic disability retirees. It's a process DRS has for various different types of payments. However, it is a fairly cumbersome process. I've also attached that document, which is like a 25-page document, so I'm sorry for attaching that if you printed this off, but just kind of walking through the why there are some vendors that wouldn't allow their members to sign up for that. So obviously first the retiree must find healthcare coverage, and also according to DRS there's been some issues, especially with some catastrophic retirees out of state where they've had difficulty finding healthcare coverage. And then next the retiree must submit copies of 2 documents, proof of insurance and proof of payment. And they, like I said, they must continually do this preferably every 6 months, or there's, like I said, no time limit. And so catastrophic retirees, especially those that may not have family members or a support system helping them out with this, or especially those who may have cognitive issues that are why they have a catastrophic disability retirement, this can be a very troublesome process to work through. And then I talked with DRS about what they do if they don't hear back from a member, especially like those 4 retirees have never received a reimbursement. And so they do have a process of calling the member, mailing the member, trying to get a hold of that member and make sure it's at least a conscious decision they're making to not seek reimbursement. So this is a proposal that's gone to the legislature before from the LEF2 board. In 2009, there was a proposal to do this. The Healthcare Authority had a fiscal note of $4.7 million for the 13-15 biennium on that, and part of that cost was based on the table below of HCA assumed there would be 14 catastrophic retirements a year, and there you see the experience, and 14 was much too high of an estimate. This 2009 legislation, that $4.7 million is the implicit cost only, so the increased cost of adding catastrophic disability retirees to the PEB risk pool, which is what this proposal would be too. It's not for the explicit cost of actually paying the members' premiums, which that was provided in a later bill that was passed. And so the data there showing 4.5, that's the experience study rate. The actual experience is a little less than that. Talk to the actuaries about that, about what they, and they would see that likely they would have 4.5 or something close to 4.5 as a recommendation if this bill was to move forward, because of some of the changes to, yes, thank you, presumption, that was the word, thank you, to presumptive diseases may increase catastrophic retirees in the coming years. And I've been working with Healthcare Authority to get updated costs on this because I knew it would be a bit more of a process than a normal fiscal note. They work with a contracted actuary, Milliman, to update their fiscal notes. So I was hoping to have it before this meeting, but they're probably going to get it to me Friday. So just to reiterate some of the policy considerations here, the pros of providing catastrophic disability retirees access to PEB: ensure all catastrophic retirees have access to quality health care coverage, and ease the administrative burden both on members and DRS. And some of the cons are the cost to Left Plan 2, and that it removes that option of choice for members. So I had some of the policy options, but Steve, it sounds like we're moving forward with, for next steps with policy option 1 for the next board meeting?
What we'll do for the next board meeting is pick up right where you're at now. And whether you'll move forward with one of these two options, the decision about what option you'll make at the December meeting.
So any questions before then?
Question for you, Jake.
Yeah.
Have we heard from anybody regarding this issue? Has anybody reached out to us regarding, hey, I'm a catastrophic retiree and I've had this experience, or I would like this changed because I have had this experience, or I would not like it changed because I like what I have now. Have we heard anything like that?
So no one's reached out to me in the year I've been here on this, and I know this has been an issue that's come up for years now. You've heard this proposal, so I don't know if Steve's aware of anyone recently.
Yeah, we've heard from both sides. Again, the issue was first brought to us by Department of Retirement Systems a couple, 3 years ago or so. When the board first started discussing it at that time, then we heard from people on both sides of the issue that mandating PEB access might make it easier for them to find a provider. PEB's all over the state, and you can even access PEB if you're out of state. So there was some members who had problems finding a medical insurance provider where they lived. Maybe they only had one choice where they lived. Similarly, there were a number of members who felt like the insurance that they had now was better than PEB, and they didn't want to be mandated into PEB. And then we've got the updated, or we've had some of the follow-up discussions with Healthcare Authority, because adding PEB or adding catastrophic disability retirees to the pool is very different from adding surviving spouses to the pool, because catastrophic disability retirees, by definition, have medical conditions that are beyond the average, whereas the surviving spouses were just assumed to be the average medical condition for their age, sort of a deal. And even their age is all over the board, because the line of duty deaths don't have any average age associated with them as well. So this is definitely an issue where there would be, from the member perspective, to some extent, for lack of better, winners and losers. There would be some administrative benefit to DRS, and then there would be some administrative impact to HCA and some cost associated with that as well.
Any questions for Steve? Jacob? All right. Thank you, Jacob. So we'll move on to your next presentation.
You go. Okay, so survivor option reelection. This is a short presentation, a comprehensive follow-up. There were a few outstanding issues at the last meeting that I need to follow up with the board on. So a reminder, the issue here is that members must make an irrevocable decision for survivor benefit prior to knowing exactly what their pension benefit will be. And the policy question for you is, should members have an opportunity to change their survivor option after retirement? And the board has looked at two instances where they may want to give members this option, and that is right after retirement, after they've received a couple checks and know exactly what their retirement check will be. And then also there are instances where there is a recalculation of their benefit post-retirement, and should members at that point, under certain circumstances, have an option to change their survivor option. So the follow-up was I got updated DRS recalculation data, and then OSA feedback on the potential impact of some of the anti-selection risk mitigation options we were looking at. So the updated recalc data, so I mentioned this before, that the recalc, that the board was looking at potentially giving members an option to change the survivor option when DRS does a recalculation of their data. As a reminder, the recalculation typically is no fault of the members. It is employer reporting error is the most common example. And so the data that I had been sharing with you over the last year found that there was a pretty significant issue with that. When I had requested so DRS had provided me what I thought was fiscal year 2018 data, but instead it was fiscal year 2018 data, but only for members who also retired in 2018. So it was limited to those who retired in 2018 and had a recalculation in 2018. And so that left out all of the kind of worst case scenarios of members who had been retired for years and then had a recalculation. And it had some pretty dramatic differences on the data. And actually I had them, when they provided me updated data, it wasn't for fiscal year, it was for calendar year 2018, so a little more recent, but that also, I believe, had an impact on the data. So kind of ignored the old data, and here's much more accurate data moving forward with. The percent of change in benefit was similar to prior data. However, the previous data only showed that there was an 18% resulted in a decrease to a member's benefit, and as you can see here, it was actually 80% resulted in a decrease to a member's benefit. And so that shows that when a recalc is done, that it is typically bad news for the member, and they typically get hit with it twice. Actually, I'll get to that when I show you the next slide. And I was also going to add that the largest amount of change in a monthly benefit was $507, and the largest percentage in change to a benefit was a little over 16%. And so the new data also impacted the timeliness of the DRS recalcs. You can see here that many of them went over that 1 year window. In fact, the majority were in the 2 to 5 years. Asked them about the super long ones that were over 10 years, like what was the cause for those. And so the two longest recalcs were the result of an audit the DRS did, where an employer was not reporting holiday bank cash outs correctly. And then the largest change in a monthly benefit was due to an employer that realized they were making payments in lieu of Social Security that should not have been reported to DRS. When a benefit decreases and a member's been retired, especially a member's been retired for a long time, they really end up taking a double hit on their pension, in that they get the new benefit amount and then they're paying back what they were paid incorrectly over those years. And typically members don't make a lump sum payment on that. Instead, they take an actuarial reduction on their benefit in order to pay it back over their lifetime. And
So, for example, if like that $500 a month, if it was over 10 years later, might actually be $1,000 a month, depending on.
Yeah, I should get that specific data. I'll get that from DRS of what the member ended up taking as a total reduction.
Yeah, and Jacob, then there's also the possibility that if it's due to employer reporting error, that the employer is on the hook for the overpayments and not the member? Can we see if we can get any data from DRS about when the employers were billed for that?
They're only on the hook for paying it back, correct? They're not on the hook for continuing to overpay the member.
That's right. They're only on the hook for the past overpayments. There's nothing that can be done legally about the reduced benefit moving forward.
Yeah, get more information about that. So the other issue the board wanted more information about was the anti-selection risk, and so we had a lot of options to choose from, and there was a question of whether one of those kind of what the impact really was. Did it really have much of an impact? So as a reminder, what is anti-selection risk? The further away from the original retirement date, the higher the risk for adverse selection because the member has more knowledge of their health and the health of their beneficiaries. So they have an incentive to change that joint and survivor option. And so OSA didn't have the data or information to provide like what the actual cost of the options we were looking at would be. So instead what they provided me with was a ranking of the options. So most of these are options that the board was already looking at. And so they just provided a ranking. And the specific option that there was interest in whether it really did much or not is listed under option 3. And so I'll go through those options in a sec again for you guys. But then it was that change was it would just allow them, if their benefit went down, they could only lower their joint and survivor option. If their benefit went up, they could only give a greater joint and survivor option. And that was just one of the options the board was considering. So you see it was kind of in the middle, not going to have a huge impact, but would have some impact. So I don't, Steve, do you want me to go through all these options since there's not a quorum to?
Just briefly, you're not taking action, so this is be informational. You'll be taking action in December when it's before you for a final.
So policy option 1 is a window for all left 2 members, and this is really just regarding right after you retire, having either a 60, 90, 120 day or a different number window to change your survivor benefit. And like I said at the beginning, the thought process there is allow a member to receive a couple pension checks, compare that to what they were estimated to receive, and have a chance to change that. And as a reminder, we looked at other states, and Oregon was the best example we could find where they could provide us some data and had a very minor impact. A very small percentage of people changed their option. Option 2 is a qualifying event window. And this is if there is a recalc allowing the member to change, and we were looking at whether it should be tied to a percentage change. So if there's a recalc and it's a very small change, maybe members shouldn't have an option, but if there's a large change, they should have an option to change that. Option 3 was the one with that anti-selection risk mitigation I was speaking about. So another thing to consider. Sounds like it would have a fairly minor impact on cost. And then combinations to allow both a window at the time of retirement and then a window if there is a recalculation. So this was one with a lot of options for you. So Steve kind of went over the next steps. Yeah.
Representative Berquist.
Thanks. You were mentioning kind of the back pay component to this possibly. So like in option 3, let's say somebody had a 5% cut, but it was 10 years down the road, they decrease their survivor option. It would almost be like, is there also an amortization over how you get that money back? And would that kind of make up for the downfall? How does this work? I'm trying to understand.
We'll bring all that back to you in December. We'll have some math examples to show you.
So I don't think we've taken that into account.
To play out the policy piece for each of these.
That piece that you got back pay potentially, I think we did. Maybe I didn't quite understand how that part worked.
Well, and we'll want to get some clarification from DRS on how that works as well. before December. But what we'll give you is not just sort of the words, but examples of each of these.
So I was curious if there's, like, is there a certain amount of look back that you are allowed? You know, is there more than 3 years? Is it just goes all the way back? Because I know for like the bill we passed last year.
Yeah, under statute, DRS is authorized to correct errors, and there's no limit. There's no like statute of limitations on an error. So if an error has been going on for 10 years, DRS can correct that.
I guess I mean on the other side. So should someone select a new option, is there a timeline where we can say you can only look back 3 years to have that increase? You know, how does that?
Yeah, so I think I understand. So are they going to get a check for 10 years if they've made 10 years of survivor benefit payments, a reduction, and then they're going to change it? Should they get a check for all of that, or is it just changed prospectively?
That's kind of my question.
Yeah, the proposals have all been based on the idea that the change is prospective only. So no retroactive. If you've paid for a survivor benefit for the last 10 years, you wouldn't get a refund.
Like if you went from 50% to 100%, you don't get that last 10 years of the 50% difference.
That's right.
That would be the plan that we would probably be looking at. Okay.
And that would mirror what happens right now with I forget the term for the bump up that occurs if you have a joint survivor benefit, spouse dies, then your benefit goes up moving forward, but you don't get a refund for all of the reduction you took previously. Okay. Any other questions?
No questions for Jacob. We'll move on.
All right, again, this is not intended to scare you off from attending the December board meeting. The last item on the agenda for today is the agenda items for future meetings, which includes December. And it's going to be a busy month, but let me just give you a quick highlight. You'll be getting a couple of updates from SIB, their annual update, and you'll also get a presentation from OSA on plan maturity and risk metrics. And then you'll have the final presentation on the tribal membership report that you heard earlier. And then you've got 4 topics that you'll be voting on. Funding corridor that we talked about earlier, the interrupted military service credit issue that you didn't hear today, but you've heard in the past. You've kind of got, by way of reminder, you've already passed out one bill to the legislature, and that was the month of death with the select committee. You've got 3 other potential bills now that you'll be considering in December. The interrupted military, and then the 2 that you heard today, PEB coverage for catastrophic and the survivor option. That's your plan for December. Depending on the amount of time for the discussion on all of those, it could go, past noon, but depending on how quickly some of those get resolved as well, it may just be more like a half-day type of thing. But we'll make sure that you have all the time that you need to discuss the pros and cons of each of these. And then, again, because of the importance of having a quorum at December, if there are any of you that know that you can't make it in December, let us know ASAP. We had a couple of other issues that you mentioned in your October meeting. Policies, internal policies, a staff attendance policy, and an attendance policy and an education policy. We'll be bringing those back to you too. And there you go. So that's roughly 7 or 8 votes, which is a lot historically for you guys for December, but manageable. We'll have stuff prepared for you on all of them. There was an issue that was brought to my attention too after the vote, unfortunately, on the calendar, that the alternative date that we proposed for November conflicts with the IFEBP conference, and therefore that alternative date that we proposed that you voted to adopt might not actually work. So we'll see about finding a different date for November and bring that back to you for your consideration in December as well. So that's one more vote, potentially. With that, any questions about December? All right.
Anybody scared? I'm not scared, Steve.
You're not scared? All right, I'll see you on the 18th of December.
Motion to adjourn? All those in favor? Aye, aye, aye. Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, point of order.
Close down my meeting.